It was supposed to be a normal 4th of July weekend. Every year, my cousins and I and Uncle Rob would head up to his family's old cabin in Leesburg. It's nothing fancy, more like a glorified shed really, but it's in the middle of nowhere, deep woods all around, right on top of this small hill overlooking a creek bed. We were all guys that year, me, my 2 cousins Mike and Dave. We were all around the same age back then, maybe 16, 17. And Uncle Rob was like the cool uncle, you know? Let us do whatever, as long as we were back before dark, mostly. We arrived Friday afternoon. It was hot, sticky, that typical humid summer heat. We unpacked, tossed our bags in the cabin, which smelled like must and old wood, opened up all the windows to air it out. The usual cabin stuff. We were excited just to be away from town, out in the woods, doing guy stuff. We spent Friday messing around, chopping wood, exploring the trails a little bit, and just generally enjoying being outdoors. That night we had a fire, grilled burgers, told stupid jokes and some scary stories that were supposed to freak each other out, but they were mostly corny. It was a normal, fun summer night. Saturday was more of the same. We went swimming in the lake about a half-hour away, came back, did some more hiking. We were starting to get into that rhythm of being away, being unplugged. No phones really worked out there anyway, which was part of the point. We were supposed to be roughing it, even though the cabin had electricity and running water, just not like internet roughing it. Saturday night's fire was bigger. We stayed up later just talking. Nothing felt weird at all. It was just normal. Sunday was the day before we were supposed to leave, and it was like a switch flipped, but so subtle you almost wouldn't notice it at first. It was still hot during the day, but there was this feeling in the air, this heaviness. The sky was weirdly still, not a cloud moving, but it wasn't sunny and bright. It was more like a flat grey kind of light. Later in the afternoon, it started to drizzle, just a little bit. Enough to make the woods smell damp and earthy. It didn't bother us much. We were used to the weather changing out there. We were getting ready to make dinner around maybe 7:30, something like that. The light was starting to go, that deep twilight where everything gets shadowy and the colors get muted. Uncle Rob was inside, starting up the propane stove, and me and my cousins were outside on the deck, which is this wooden platform built onto the front of the cabin. It overlooks the creek bed, maybe a 30-foot drop down to the water, if that. It's all trees on the other side of the creek, dense woods. We were just leaning on the railing, shooting the breeze about something stupid when it happened. First thing I noticed was the silence. I mean, complete silence. Usually in the woods, even when it's quiet, there's still noise. Bugs humming, birds chirping, the wind in the leaves. Something. But this was like nothing. Like someone had hit the mute button on the whole world. It wasn't just quiet, it was empty. That was the first thing that made my skin prickle. It felt unnatural. Then, out of that dead silence, came this sound. It wasn't loud at first, more like a distant whimper, but it wasn't an animal whimper. It sounded almost human, but wrong. Like someone trying to scream, but their throat was all messed up, or they were underwater or something. It was high-pitched, and it just cut through the silence like glass shattering. It wasn't a howl, or a bark, or anything you'd recognize from nature. It was just this raw, piercing, awful sound. It sent a shiver right down my spine. We all stopped talking. We just stood there, frozen, listening. The whimper came again, a little louder this time, and then it turned into a scream. But not a human scream either. It was higher, sharper, more unhinged, like pure agony, but amplified, distorted. It was the most unsettling sound I've ever heard in my life. Even now, years later, just thinking about it makes my stomach clench up. It was coming from the other side of the creek bed, from deep in the woods across from the cabin. Mike was the first one to say something. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, his voice shaky. Dave just shook his head, his eyes wide, staring into the darkness across the creek. It was getting darker fast. The drizzle had stopped, but the sky was still that heavy grey colour, making everything look even more ominous. Uncle Rob came out of the cabin then, looking confused. "What's all the quiet about? I thought I heard, did you guys hear something?" He sounded like he was trying to play it cool, but I could see he was tense. "Yeah, Uncle Rob," I said. "Something just screamed, over there." I pointed across the creek into the woods. He squinted into the darkness, his brow furrowed. "Screamed? Like what? An animal?" "No," Dave said, his voice still hushed. "Not like an animal. It sounded bad." That's when we heard it again. This time it was closer, and it wasn't just a scream anymore. It was like crashing, heavy crashing, like branches breaking, trees snapping. It was loud, like something huge was moving through the woods, and it wasn't being quiet about it. Whatever it was big, and it was coming closer. "What the—" Uncle Rob started, but then cut himself off. He took a step forward, peering harder into the trees. "Did you see anything?" "No, it's too dark," Mike said, "but I hear it. It's getting closer." The crashing sounds were getting louder, faster. Whatever it was moving with incredible speed, and whatever was making the screaming sound, it seemed to be connected to this crashing, like it was leading the charge. Then something hit the deck, hard. It was a loud thud, and the whole wooden deck vibrated. We all jumped back, startled. "What was that?" Dave yelled. Uncle Rob grabbed one of the lanterns hanging on the deck railing and held it up, shining it towards where the sound had come from. He swept the light around, trying to see something in the dark woods across the creek. That's when the rocks started. The first one hit the roof of the cabin. It was a loud bang, like someone had thrown a bowling ball onto the roof. Then another one hit the deck, closer to us this time, skittering across the wood. They were big rocks, not pebbles, but like fist-sized, maybe bigger. And they were coming from across the creek, from the woods where we heard the screaming and the crashing. "What the hell?" Uncle Rob shouted, spinning around, the lantern shaking in his hand. He shone it back across the creek, trying to find the source of the rocks. Another rock hit the deck, whizzing past my head. It was thrown hard, with force. It wasn't just rolling down a hill. Someone or something was throwing these rocks at us, from way across the creek. "Get inside! Get inside now!" Uncle Rob yelled, pushing us towards the cabin door. He shoved Mike and Dave in first, then me, and then he scrambled in after us, slamming the door shut and fumbling with the latch. We were all breathing hard, adrenaline pumping. We stood there, crammed inside the small cabin, staring at the door like it was going to burst open any second. Outside, the rocks kept coming. Bang! Another one on the roof. Thud! One hit the side of the cabin wall. Clatter! One bounced off the deck railing and landed in the dirt below. "Who is that?" Uncle Rob yelled, his voice tight with fear. He was peering through the small window next to the door, trying to see out. "Is someone out there? Is this some kind of joke?" But it wasn't a joke. You could feel it. This wasn't kids messing around. This was something else. Something wrong. The rocks kept coming, a steady barrage. They were hitting the cabin from all sides now, roof, walls, deck, even the windows rattled from the impact. It was terrifying. We were trapped inside this wooden box, being pelted with rocks by something we couldn't see, couldn't understand. Uncle Rob grabbed the other lantern from the table and lit it. The cabin flickered with yellowish light, pushing back some of the darkness, but it didn't help much. It just made the shadows dance in the corners, making everything feel even more claustrophobic. "We need to call the police," Dave said, his voice trembling. "No signal," Uncle Rob said grimly, shaking his head. "No phone service out here, remember?" He was right. We were completely cut off, isolated, at the mercy of whatever was outside. The rock barrage kept up for what felt like forever. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Each impact was like a punch to the gut, a reminder that we were completely vulnerable. The screaming had stopped and the crashing sounds had faded, but the rocks kept coming, relentlessly, like a machine, accurate and powerful. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The rocks stopped hitting the cabin. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees and the crackling of the lanterns inside the cabin. The silence was back, but this time it was different. It wasn't just empty silence. It was charged silence. Heavy, oppressive silence filled with dread. We stood there, frozen again, listening, waiting, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. We didn't know if it was over, if they were just waiting, if they were still out there watching us. Is it gone?" Mike whispered, his voice barely audible. Uncle Rob held up a hand, signaling for silence. He moved slowly to the window again and peered cautiously out. He held the lantern up to the glass, trying to see into the darkness beyond, but it was too dark. The woods were just a black wall, swallowing up the lantern light. He stood there for a long time, just staring, listening. Then finally, he turned back to us, his face pale and drawn. "I don't see anything," he said quietly. "But I don't hear anything either." He blew out one of the lanterns, plunging half the cabin into deeper shadow. "We need to conserve fuel," he said, his voice low. "We don't know how long this is going to last." We sat down then, on the floor, huddled together in the flickering light of the remaining lantern. The fear was thick in the air. You could almost taste it. None of us said anything for a long time. What was there to say? We were trapped, terrified, and completely in the dark about what was happening. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and exhaustion. We barely spoke. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves outside made us jump. We were listening for any sound, any sign that the rocks were going to start again. But there was nothing, just silence and darkness. The lantern eventually started to flicker and die, the fuel running low. Uncle Rob turned it off completely, and we were plunged into total darkness. The darkness was worse than the noise. In the dark, your imagination runs wild. Every shadow becomes a monster. Every sound is amplified, distorted by fear. I kept thinking about that scream, that horrible, unearthly sound, and the way those rocks were thrown, with such force, such intent. It felt personal somehow, like whatever was out there wanted to hurt us. We stayed awake all night, huddled together in the darkness, waiting for the dawn. It felt like the longest night of my life. Every minute stretched out, an eternity of fear. I don't think any of us really slept. We just sat there, backs against the wall, eyes wide open, staring into the blackness, listening for the slightest sound. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, a faint grey light started to seep through the cracks in the cabin walls. Dawn was breaking. Slowly, painfully slowly, the darkness began to recede. As the light grew stronger, a sliver of hope started to creep in. Maybe, just maybe, it was over. When it was finally light enough, Uncle Rob cautiously opened the cabin door. He stood there for a moment, looking out, his hand on the latch, ready to slam it shut again if he needed to. Then he stepped out onto the deck. We followed him, blinking in the pale morning light, hesitant, still afraid of what we might find. The woods were still, silent. Everything looked normal, too normal. Then we saw them. Across the creek, deep in the woods, where we'd heard the screaming and the crashing, were these things. They looked like pyramids, but made of rocks, huge rocks, bigger than the ones that had been thrown at the cabin, stacked on top of each other, perfectly balanced, forming these crude, jagged pyramids. There were several of them, scattered throughout the woods, in the trees across the creek. We just stared at them, speechless. They looked so deliberate, like they had been built intentionally. But by what and why? And how could anything build structures like that in the dark, in the woods, and then throw rocks at our cabin all night? We went down to the edge of the creek bed and looked across. The pyramids were still there, stark and silent against the backdrop of the trees. They looked menacing, watching us. but there was no movement, no sound, nothing else. Just the rock pyramids and the unsettling silence of the woods. We packed up quickly that morning. Uncle Rob didn't say much. He just looked grim and shaken. We loaded up the car and left without breakfast, without a word. We just wanted to get out of there. We never went back to the cabin after that. Uncle Rob sold it a few months later. He never talked about what happened that night. Neither did we, not really. It was like a pact we all made to just forget it ever happened, but I haven't forgotten. I can't forget. Sometimes, late at night when it's quiet, I still hear that scream in my head, and I see those rock pyramids standing silent and watchful in the woods across the creek. I don't know what it was. I don't know what made those sounds or threw those rocks or built those things. I just know it was real. And I know I never want to experience anything like that again as long as I live. It was just pure terror, the kind that sticks with you. To this day, thinking about it gives me the chills, and I still can't explain any of it. Story 2. Okay, so I just gotta tell someone about this. I don't even know where else to go with it. Boulder's beautiful, right? Mountains like teeth against the sky. Fresh air you can taste. That's what I thought coming from the city. Needed a change, some space. Ended up renting a cabin kind of outside of town. Figured I'd be all about nature and peace and quiet. Peaceful. Yeah, right. It started pretty normal, getting to know the local spots. There's this bar down the road, the Elkhorn. Place looks like it's been there since the gold rush. All dark wood and taxidermied animals staring down at you. Seemed like a good place to get the lay of the land, you know? Grab a beer, hear some local stories, and boy, did I hear stories. First couple of times it was just the usual small-town stuff, who's dating who, whose tractor broke down, the price of lumber. Then one night, a few beers in, the talk turned to the woods. And not like, oh, the aspen trees are turning, kind of woods talk. More like, what lives in the woods talk. It started kinda casual. Someone mentioned seeing weird tracks out past Gold Hill. Another guy, wiry dude with eyes that looked like they'd seen too much sun, said his dog's been acting skittish, barking at nothing in the middle of the night, ever since he walked a section of trail up near Nederland. I'm listening, but honestly, thinking it's just mountain folk lore, you know? Every place has its legends. Then this older guy, Chegger Phelps, he was sitting at the end of the bar, nursing a whiskey. He hadn't said much all night, just listening. Chegger's weathered, like carved out of granite weathered, face like a road map of hard living, and this way of looking at you that just kinda cuts through the bullshit. He cleared his throat and just said, Bigfoot. The bar got a little quieter. Not like dead quiet, but that low murmur kinda dropped off. People were looking at him like they knew he was about to say something worth hearing. Chegger doesn't talk much usually, or so I was told later. When he does, people listen. You city folks, he says, eyes landing on me for a second, then back to his whiskey. You come up here thinking it's all postcards and pretty hikes. You don't know what's really out there. He took a sip of his drink, the ice clinking in the glass. Out there, there's things that ain't in your nature shows. I was still figuring it was going to be some bear story, maybe mountain lion, something normal-ish blown out of proportion. I even kind of smirked a little, like, Bigfoot, really? I probably shouldn't have. Chegger just looked at me, not angry, but heavy, like I'd said something profoundly stupid. Then he rolls up the sleeve of his flannel shirt, and that's when it hit me that something was seriously wrong with his left arm. From the elbow down, it wasn't there, just a stump, scarred up and gnarly looking. It was messed up, man. Not like a clean cut or something. It looked ripped. He held it out a little, not waving it around, just letting it sit there. Bigfoot, he said again, quiet like he was talking to himself, took it clean off. The bar was silent now. You could hear the hum of the neon beer sign, the low crackle of the fireplace. Someone coughed nervously. And Chegger, he started telling his story. His voice was low and gravelly, like rocks tumbling down a hillside. He said it happened years ago, back when he was logging up near Rollinsville. He was working a crew, rough bunch, out in the middle of nowhere, weeks at a time in a logging camp. Hard work, hard drinking, the kind of place where trouble finds you whether you're looking for it or not. One day, some of the younger guys, feeling brave after too much beer, went off exploring. They came back bragging, all puffed up, saying they'd seen something in the woods, something big, hairy. They'd spooked it, it ran off, typical bravado crap. But then, one of them said they'd found something else. A baby. A baby Bigfoot. I know, it sounds insane even now. But Chegger was telling it. And the way he was saying it, looking straight ahead, not making eye contact with anyone, it felt real. Disturbingly real. They'd found this juvenile, he called it. Smaller, but still huge, still powerful looking, trapped in some kind of natural pitfall. They figured, drunk and stupid, it would be a laugh to bring it back to camp. Show it off. So they got ropes, managed to drag it out, and somehow hauled it back to the camp tied up. Chegger said he was against it from the start. He knew even then it was a bad idea, messing with something like that. But he was outnumbered and, frankly, probably not sober enough himself to put his foot down hard enough. They caged it in this old storage shed they used for equipment, thinking it was some kind of joke, some drunken prank that would blow over in the morning. That night wasn't a joke. The mother came. Chegger was on watch. They'd drawn straws, and he got stuck with guard duty. He was sitting outside the shed, rifle across his lap, feeling uneasy, but mostly just annoyed. It was cold, the wind was picking up, and inside the shed he could hear this low, whimpering sound, like a dog in pain, but deeper, more guttural. It was getting to him. Then the woods went silent, completely silent. No crickets, no wind in the trees, nothing. Just this oppressive quiet. Chegger said the hair on the back of his neck stood straight up. He felt this presence. Something big was out there, watching. Then he heard it. A sound that he said he'd never forget, a sound that still haunted his sleep. It started as a low growl, deep in the chest, like a bear, but more primal, more filled with rage than anything he'd ever imagined. It built slowly, getting louder, more furious, until it became this full-throated roar that shook the ground under his feet. It wasn't animal, not just animal. It was intelligent fury, directed, intentional. The trees started to shake, not from wind, but from something moving through them, something massive, crashing, breaking branches, tearing through the undergrowth, getting closer. Chegger raised his rifle, heart pounding in his chest, trying to see through the darkness. Then it was there, standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the circle of firelight from the camp. He said it was huge, bigger than he ever thought possible, covered in dark fur, eyes glowing red in the firelight, and the smell. Jesus Christ, the smell. Like wet dog, but 10 times stronger, mixed with something else, something musky and foul. And anger. You could smell the anger radiating off of it in waves. It looked at the shed. Then it looked at Chegger. And it roared again, and then it charged. Chegger fired his rifle. He said he didn't even remember aiming, just pointing and pulling the trigger. He thought he hit it, saw it flinch, but it didn't even slow down. It was on him in seconds. He described it like being hit by a truck, massive weight slamming into him, throwing him backwards. He dropped the rifle. He saw these huge hands, claws like garden rakes, reaching for him. And then pain. Exploding, white-hot pain in his arm. He didn't see it take his arm. He just felt it tear, rip through flesh and bone like it was nothing. He screamed, he said he screamed like a baby. And then he was on the ground, everything spinning, blood pouring from his arm, the roar still echoing in his ears. The creature didn't stay to gloat. It went straight for the shed. Chegger watched through the haze of pain as it tore the shed apart, like it was made of cardboard, ripped off the roof, smashed through the walls, got to its young one. He heard the whimpering stop. then more roars, and then it was gone, just gone, into the woods, taking its young with it. The camp was chaos, guys yelling, trying to stop the bleeding, freaking out. Chegger almost bled out right there. They managed to get him to a hospital, barely, saved his life, but not his arm. He finished his story, took another drink of whiskey, and just looked at the stump of his arm. "They're not legends," he said, quiet. "They're real, and they ain't friendly. Leave 'em alone, you hear me? Just leave 'em alone." Nobody said anything for a long time after that. The silence was different this time. Heavy. Real. I looked at Chegger, at his ruined arm, and suddenly the woods around my cabin felt a lot less peaceful. That night, back at the cabin, every snap of a twig outside the window made me jump. I slept with the lights on, which I haven't done since I was a kid. Chegger's story had gotten to me, more than I wanted to admit. Still, I figured, maybe he was exaggerating. Maybe he was drunk or traumatized, misremembering things. Maybe it was a bear attack and the Bigfoot thing was just how he made sense of it. I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe that. The next day, I decided to go for a hike. Needed to clear my head, get some fresh air, prove to myself it was just stories. I picked a trail I hadn't done before, up towards Sugarloaf Mountain. Figured it would be a nice, easy hike, beautiful views, get some pictures. The trailhead was deserted when I got there, which was unusual, even on a weekday. Still, I figured, more peace and quiet for me, right? I started up the trail, feeling okay at first. Sun was shining, birds were singing, the air was crisp, beautiful just like the postcards. But as I went deeper into the woods, I started to feel uneasy, like I was being watched. That feeling you get when someone is staring at you from behind, even though you can't see them. I kept looking over my shoulder, but there was nothing there, just trees, shadows, silence. The silence was wrong, like the silence Chegger described. There were no birds singing now, no squirrels chattering, nothing. Just the sound of my own boots crunching on the trail and my heart starting to pound a little harder. I told myself it was just my imagination, Chegger's story messing with my head. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It got stronger, more insistent, like a weight pressing down on my chest. Then I smelled it. That smell Chegger described. Faint at first, just a whiff, but definitely there. Musky, animal, foul. It made my stomach turn. I stopped dead in my tracks, listened. The silence was deafening, smelled again, stronger now, closer. It was coming from the woods to my left, off the trail, deeper in. I should have turned back then. I know I should have. Every instinct was screaming at me to run, but I don't know why I didn't. Curiosity? Stupidity? Maybe a little of both. I told myself, just take a peek, just see what it is. Like an idiot in a horror movie. I stepped off the trail, slowly, carefully, moving into the trees. The smell was overpowering now, thick in the air. My breath caught in my throat. And then I heard it. Movement, heavy movement, breaking branches, snapping twigs just ahead, getting closer. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I was terrified, truly terrified, but I couldn't move, frozen, stuck. Staring into the trees, waiting, and then I saw it. Just a glimpse at first. Something huge, dark, moving between the trees, too big to be a bear, too tall, way too tall. It stepped into a small clearing, and I saw it clearly for maybe 2-3 seconds, and those seconds are burned into my brain, forever. It was massive, taller than any man, easily, covered in thick, dark, matted fur, a hulking, muscular shape, but it wasn't animalistic in the way you'd expect. It was almost human, but wrong, terribly wrong. The shoulders were too broad, the arms too long, the neck too thick, the head too small for the body, set low and forward. And the face. I didn't see details of the face, not really, just shadow, and 2 eyes, glowing red in the dim light of the woods, just like Chegger said, burning red, looking right at me. It turned its head just slightly, and I saw the muscle move under the fur. And the size of it, it wasn't just big, it was immense, solid, power radiating off it, unimaginable power. And it smelled me. I know it smelled me. It sniffed the air, head tilted slightly, those red eyes fixed on me. And then it took a step forward, a slow step, but heavy, powerful, crushing twigs and leaves underfoot. That's when I broke. I didn't think, didn't hesitate. I just turned and ran like my life depended on it, because I knew in that instant that it did. I ran back to the trail, stumbling, tripping, crashing through bushes, not looking back, just running, blind terror driving me forward. I didn't stop running until I was back at my car, slamming the door shut, locking it, fumbling with the keys to start the engine. I didn't breathe normally again until I was miles down the road, speeding away from those woods, away from that trail, away from whatever the hell that was. I haven't been back on a trail since. Haven't been back to the Elkhorn. Barely sleep. Every little noise outside my cabin window now makes me jump. The woods aren't peaceful anymore. They're something else, something dark and ancient and terrifying. I still can't explain what I saw, can't rationalize it. Was it Bigfoot? I don't know. I don't want to know. All I know is I saw something in those woods that day that changed me. Something real, something monstrous. And I got away, barely, and I don't ever want to see it again, ever. And the worst part, sometimes when it's really quiet late at night and the wind is just right, I think I can still smell it, that musky, foul, angry smell. And I remember those red eyes, burning red, watching me from the trees. It's out there. I know it is. And now I believe Chegga, completely. Story 3. It was getting late in the day, you know. The kind of late where the shadows get long and everything gets a bit cooler. Me and my cousins, we'd been up Shahali's Way all day, trying to track some deer. Nothing. Not a damn thing. You know how it is sometimes. You spend the whole day out there and come back empty-handed. We were heading back towards the lake, Harrison Lake, figuring we'd call it a day. We were walking single file, me in the lead, just following the path we'd made coming in, when we started hearing it. At first, it was just noises, rustling, branches, snapping, nothing out of the ordinary for the woods, right? But it was heavy, like something big was moving around. We stopped for a second, listened. We thought maybe a couple of bears got into it, fighting over something. That happens, you know. Bears get territorial, especially around this time of year, getting ready for winter. We were still for a minute, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. It was deeper in the woods, towards the canyon, Chehalis Canyon. The noises got louder. Not just rustling now, but cracking, like trees were getting pushed around. We started walking again, slower this time, more careful. Curiosity, I guess. Or maybe just plain dumb. We were young then, not thinking too much about danger. And then we heard the growls. Low at first, rumbling sounds that made your chest vibrate, like when you hear thunder far off in the mountains. But these growls, they weren't far off. They were close, too damn close. We stopped again, and this time there was something else mixed in with the growls. Shouts, but not human shouts. Deeper, more primal, like something in pain or angry or both. It was hard to tell. My cousin Thomas, he tugged on my shirt sleeve. He looked pale, even in the fading light. Bears, he whispered. But it didn't sound like just bears. Even bear fights are usually more roaring. This was different. There was a struggle in the sounds, a violence that felt different. We stood there, 3 young men, just listening to this chaos erupting from the trees. It was getting darker now, the sun dipping behind the mountains. The woods were already shadowy and thick, and whatever was going on in there, it was happening in the thickest part. And then we heard it. The howl. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. Not a bear howl, not a wolf. It was human, but not quite. It was too deep, too raw, too full of something else, something that sent shivers right down your spine. It was a sound of pure agony and rage mixed together, if that makes sense. Like a wounded animal, but an animal that was way too big and way too human. That's when the bear idea went out the window. We all knew, even without saying it out loud. This was something else. This was Sasquatch. We'd heard the stories, of course. Everyone around Harrison knows the stories. Old folks tell them around the fire. But you never really think you'll see one, you know? You think it's just stories. But that howl, that sound, it wasn't just a story anymore. It was real, right there, in the woods. Fear? Yeah, we were scared. But it was more than just fear. It was like awe, too, like witnessing something ancient, something you weren't supposed to see. We edged closer, cautiously. There was an old watchtower not too far from where we were, used to spot fires, abandoned for years. We figured if we could get to that, we could maybe see something, be a little safer, higher up. We moved slowly, trying not to make any noise ourselves. Every snap of a twig under our feet sounded like thunder in the sudden quiet moments between the fighting. We finally got to the tower. It was rickety, the wood was old and weathered, but it was still standing. We climbed up, carefully, one at a time. The view from the top was something else. You could see into the trees a bit better from up there. It was still twilight, but there was enough light to make out shapes moving below, and the sounds were even louder now, coming up to us from the forest floor. Growls, roars, crashes, and that awful, almost human yelling. Then we saw them. Or it. It was hard to make out details at first, just two huge shapes wrestling on the ground, in a patch of moonlight that broke through the trees. Dust and leaves were flying everywhere. It was a massive bear, a grizzly, bigger than any I'd ever seen in my life. And the other thing, it was taller, darker, covered in hair, like the stories said. Sasquatch. It was really happening. They were locked together, a tangle of fur and muscle. The bear was snapping, teeth flashing in the dim light, claws raking, but the Sasquatch, it was different. It was using its hands. Long arms reaching around the bear, grabbing, holding. You could see the sheer power in its movements. The bear was strong, no doubt, but this was something else. It was raw, untamed strength, like the strength of the earth itself. They rolled around, crashing through bushes, snapping smaller trees like they were twigs. The ground was shaking. It was the most brutal, violent thing I'd ever seen, not like two animals fighting. It was a battle. A war for something, territory maybe, or just pure primal hate. We watched, frozen on that tower, hearts pounding in our chests. We were terrified, yeah, but we couldn't look away. It was like we were hypnotized, drawn into this ancient drama playing out in front of us. We were supposed to be the hunters, but we were just witnesses to something far bigger than ourselves. The fight went on. And on. Seemed like forever. The bear was putting up a hell of a fight, I'll give it that. Snarling, biting, clawing. It was trying to get away, trying to break free from the Sasquatch's grip. But it couldn't. The Sasquatch was just relentless. It was like it wouldn't let go, no matter what. And then it happened. The Sasquatch got its hands around the bear's neck. You could see it, even in the dim light, those long, thick fingers closing around the bear's throat. The bear roared, a strangled, desperate sound. It thrashed, legs kicking, claws digging into the dirt, trying to get free. But the Sasquatch just held on. Its arms were like iron bands. The bear's struggles got weaker. The roars turned into whimpers. And then silence. Except for the Sasquatch's heavy breathing, you could hear it even from up on the tower. It stood there, hunched over the bear for a long moment. Just still. Then it lifted the bear. Just lifted it. Like it was nothing. The bear was huge, a full-grown grizzly, but the Sasquatch just hauled it up off the ground. It held the bear up in front of it for a few seconds, like it was showing off its prize, or maybe checking to make sure it was really dead, and then it threw it, just threw the bear. It landed with a sickening thud a few yards away. We could hear branches snap where it landed. The Sasquatch stood there for another moment looking down at the bear. Then it turned, and it looked right at us. It was too far away to see its eyes clearly, but we could feel it, like it knew we were there, watching. It just stood there, silhouetted against the last bit of light in the sky, massive and powerful. And then, slowly, it turned and walked away, into the darkness, just vanished, into the woods. We stayed up in that tower for a long time after that. Didn't say much, just looked at each other, trying to process what we'd just seen. The silence after the fight was deafening. All the noise, the violence, just gone, leaving this emptiness behind. We finally climbed down when it was completely dark, too dark to see much of anything. We didn't go down to where the bear was. No way. We just turned and ran all the way back to the lake. Didn't stop until we were back in our canoes, paddling hard, away from those woods. We got back to the village late that night. Our families were worried sick. We told them, some of it, told them about the bear fight. Didn't mention the other thing. Didn't want them to think we were crazy or scared, although we were, both. I haven't been back to Gunnison Canyon since. Not really. I've hunted around there, yeah, but I always keep my distance from that part of the woods, and every time I'm out there I listen for the sounds, for the growls, the roars, the howls. You never forget a sound like that. It stays with you. I know what I saw that day. We all do. My cousins Thomas and Ben, they saw it too. We don't talk about it much. Not to outsiders anyway. What would they say? They'd laugh. Call us liars. Crazy Indians seeing things in the woods. But we know. We know what's out there. The stories are true. The old folks, they knew what they were talking about. There's things in these woods we don't understand. Things that are stronger, wilder than anything we can imagine. And sometimes they fight. And sometimes, if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, you get to see it. And once you do, you're never the same. Never. That night, it changed me. I look at the woods different now. I hear the sounds of the forest different now. There's always that edge, that feeling that something's watching, something big, something ancient, and you just hope it leaves you alone. You just hope it's fighting with bears and not looking for you. It's been years, you know, decades. But sometimes late at night, when it's quiet, I still hear that howl, echoing in my head. And I remember that night on the tower, watching the fight, seeing the Sasquatch, and I still get that shiver down my spine, that same fear, that same awe. It never really goes away. Some things you just can't explain. You just live with them. Story 4. Okay, so this is gonna sound crazy, and I'm not even sure why I'm typing this out now, all these years later. But something just popped into my head, and I kind of feel like I need to get it out there. It's been bugging me, off and on, for ages. Maybe putting it into words, even for strangers on the internet, will help. I don't know. It happened back in June of 2006. Me and my buddy, let's call him Mark to keep things simple, we were way into hiking back then, always looking for new spots. We lived in Colorado at the time, and we heard about this place, Black Canyon of the Gunnison National Park. Supposed to be beautiful, rugged, you know, the real deal. We were always up for a challenge, and the photos we saw online, man, it looked incredible, so we decided screw it, let's check it out. We planned a pretty ambitious hike, wanted to get deep into the backcountry, the kind of place where you feel like you're the only people for miles. We picked a trail that supposedly led to some remote lake. Couldn't find much info about it online, which honestly just made it more appealing to us at the time. We were young and dumb, full of that adventurous spirit. We figured we'd hike in before dawn, get to the lake by midday, do some fishing maybe, and then hike back out before dark. Classic day trip. We set off ridiculously early, like 4 in the morning. Still pitch black, stars blazing overhead, that crisp mountain air biting at your lungs. We had our headlamps on, backpacks loaded with water, snacks, first aid kit, the usual hiking gear. The trail started off pretty easy, winding through some scrubby brush, but it got steeper and rockier pretty fast. We were descending into the canyon, and it got darker and darker as the sun hadn't even thought about peeking over the horizon yet. I remember feeling good at first, that buzz of excitement you get at the start of an adventure, but pretty quickly I started to feel it in my ankle. See, I'd twisted it pretty bad a few months before playing basketball, and it hadn't fully healed. It was usually okay on flat ground, but going downhill, especially on uneven terrain, it started to throb. I tried to ignore it, didn't want to slow Mark down, but it got worse, real fast. Soon, every step was a little stab of pain. I had to start taking it easy, picking my steps carefully. Mark, being the good friend he was, slowed down with me. He kept asking if I was okay, if we should turn back. But I'm stubborn, always have been. Plus, we were already pretty deep in, and I figured if I just took it slow, I could manage. Big mistake in hindsight. But we kept going. The sun finally started to rise, painting the canyon walls in these crazy colors, reds and oranges and purples. It was stunning, seriously breathtaking. But I was so focused on my damn ankle, I wasn't really enjoying it as much as I should have been. The hike, which we thought would take us a few hours tops, was dragging on and on. My ankle was killing me, and we were way behind schedule. By the time we finally reached the lake, it was early afternoon. We were both exhausted, hungry, and I was in pretty significant pain. The lake itself was weird. It was nestled in this little basin, surrounded by these huge, jagged rocks, like something out of a movie. The water was dark, almost black-looking in places. It wasn't exactly picturesque, not like those crystal-clear alpine lakes you see in postcards. It was still, quiet. Too quiet, maybe. But the worst thing, the thing that really hit us first, was the smell. Jesus, the smell. It was like nothing I'd ever encountered before. Imagine rotten meat, like really, really rotten, mixed with skunk spray and something else. Sulfur. Yeah, like sulfur. It was this stomach-churning, gag-inducing stench that hung in the air, thick and heavy. It hit you in the back of your throat and just clung there. My first thought was maybe it was something in my backpack. Like, did a sandwich go bad or something? I checked, but everything seemed fine. Mark did the same, and he was just as confused. We both wrinkled our noses and looked around, trying to figure out where this god-awful smell was coming from. We thought maybe it was some kind of natural thing, like volcanic gases or something. Colorado has those, right? I was trying to rationalize it, anything to make it seem normal. But deep down, I knew it wasn't normal. That smell, it just felt wrong. We were standing near the edge of the lake, close to these massive boulders that tumbled down to the water's edge. I was still hurting, so I sat down on a rock, pulled out my water bottle and took a swig. Mark was looking around, trying to spot the source of the smell, I guess. He wandered a few steps towards the trees that lined the far side of the lake. And then we heard it. It started as a low rumble, a deep guttural growl that seemed to vibrate right through the ground. It was fast, powerful, and came from the dense woods beyond the lake. Not like a bear, not like a mountain lion, nothing like any animal I'd ever heard before. It was primal, raw, violent. It just cut through the silence of the canyon like a knife. My blood ran cold. I froze, water bottle halfway to my mouth. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was pure, unadulterated fear. That sound, it wasn't just scary, it felt wrong, like something ancient and angry and not supposed to be heard. Mark jumped back, startled. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, his eyes wide. He was pale, I could see he was scared too, even if he didn't want to admit it. I shook my head, my heart hammering in my chest. I don't know, I stammered. Sounded big. My mind raced. Bear? Yeah, maybe a bear. But it didn't sound like a bear growl. It was deeper, more menacing, and faster somehow, like whatever made that sound was capable of moving incredibly quickly. I fumbled for my backpack, suddenly feeling incredibly vulnerable, sitting out in the open like that. We were miles from anywhere, deep in the wilderness, and something big and scary was lurking nearby. I reached into my pack, my hand closing around the cold steel of my .45. Yeah, I know, probably overkill for a hike, but my grandpa had given it to me, said it was a good thing to have in bear country. I'd brought it more out of habit than anything else. Now, I was glad I had it. I stood up, careful not to put too much weight on my bad ankle, and pulled the .45 from my pack. Mark stared at me, eyes even wider now. You brought a gun? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He knew I had it, but I don't think he expected me to actually take it out. Yeah, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Just be careful. Whatever made that sound is out there. I checked the safety, making sure it was off. My hands were shaking slightly. We stood there for a moment, listening, holding our breath. The silence was heavy, broken only by the distant sound of the wind in the trees. The smell was still there, that disgusting stench, and it seemed to have gotten stronger. I could taste it now, that acrid, putrid flavor in the back of my mouth. Let's just go, Mark said, his voice strained. This place is creeping me out. He didn't argue with me about the gun. He was scared, plain and simple, and so was I. I nodded. Yeah, you're right. Let's get out of here. I wanted to turn and run, but my ankle was screaming, and I knew that would be stupid. We needed to move slowly, deliberately, and watch our backs. We started to back away from the lake, moving along the rocky shoreline, retracing our steps. I kept scanning the tree line, my gun held loosely in my right hand, finger off the trigger. Mark was right behind me, breathing heavily. We were both hyper-aware of every sound, every rustle of leaves, every shadow that moved. And then, it happened. Right there, in the spot where I had been sitting just minutes before, near the edge of the lake, something moved. Behind a cluster of huge, dark boulders, where the shadows were deepest, a figure emerged. It was dark, completely black, darker than the shadows themselves. It was low to the ground, hunched over, and it moved with an unnatural, fluid grace. It wasn't walking, it wasn't running, it was slinking, like a predator stalking its prey. It moved out from behind the rocks, and for a split second it was in the open, just long enough for me to see it clearly. It was big, bigger than a man, definitely. Covered in dark fur or hair, I couldn't tell which. Its limbs were long and powerful, and its back was broad and muscular. It was ape-like, but not exactly. Something about it was different, wrong. And then it did something that made my blood turn to ice. It stopped in the open, right in the spot where I had been fishing, and it lowered its head to the ground. It sniffed. It actually sniffed the ground, like an animal tracking a scent. It moved its head from side to side, sniffing the air, sniffing the ground, and that disgusting stench, that rotting smell, seemed to intensify around it. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. It just vanished. It moved back behind the boulders, disappearing into the shadows without a sound, without a trace. 1 second it was there, the next second it was gone. I stood there, frozen, my gun still pointed towards the rocks where it had been. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't speak. I just stared at the rocks, waiting, expecting it to reappear, to lunge at us, to do something. Mark grabbed my arm, his hand like a vice. Did you see that?" he whispered, his voice choked with terror. I nodded slowly, still staring at the rocks. My mind was blank. I had seen something real, something terrifying, but my brain couldn't process it. It was like my reality had just fractured and something impossible had slipped through the cracks. What? What the hell was that? Mark breathed, his voice trembling. Was that a bear? But it didn't look like a bear. The unspoken word hung in the air between us, heavy and terrifying. Bigfoot, the word that you hear whispered in hushed tones, the word that people laugh at, the word that exists only in blurry photos and campfire stories. But standing there, on the shores of that godforsaken lake, with that stench in the air and that image burned into my brain, there was no other explanation. I don't know, I managed to whisper back, my voice hoarse. I honestly don't know. But deep down, I knew. I knew what we had seen, and it was something that wasn't supposed to exist. We didn't say another word. We just turned and walked, quickly as we could manage with my ankle, away from that lake. We didn't look back. We didn't stop until we were back on the main trail, miles away from that place. We practically ran the last few miles, adrenaline pumping, fear driving us forward. We got back to the car as the sun was setting, exhausted, shaken, and completely silent. We drove back to town without saying a word. Mark dropped me off at my place, and I just went inside, locked the door, and collapsed onto the couch. I didn't sleep that night. I just lay there, replaying the image in my head, that dark, crouching figure sniffing the ground. The smell, the sound, the fear. It was all still so vivid, so real. I've never told anyone about it, not really. Mark and we talked about it briefly the next day, both of us still in shock. But then we just stopped talking about it. He doesn't mention it to this day. I think he just wants to forget it ever happened, and honestly, part of me wishes I could too, but I can't. That day, that hike, that lake, it stuck with me. The fear, the mystery, the sheer unexplainable weirdness of it all. I've tried to rationalize it, tried to find other explanations, but nothing makes sense. Nothing accounts for that smell, that sound, that thing we saw. Maybe it was a bear, maybe it was something else. I honestly don't know. And I think deep down, that's the most terrifying part of it. The not knowing, the uncertainty, the feeling that there are things out there, things lurking in the shadows, that we just don't understand. And sometimes, late at night, when I can't sleep, I can still smell that stench, and I can still hear that growl in my head. And I wonder, what exactly did we see that day in the dark canyons of Gunnison Valley? And was it watching us long before we ever saw it? I really don't want to know the answer, but the question just won't go away. Story 5. All right, so I don't usually do this, posting stuff like this online, but something happened a while back, and it just sticks with you. I gotta get it out there. Maybe it'll make me feel a bit better. Maybe someone else has seen something similar, I don't know. It's weird, and honestly a little messed up. It was back in 2002, late summer. I was living out in the sticks back then, near this lake, way out in nowhere. Real secluded spot. Used to go fishing there all the time, just me and my dog, Bird Dog. Dumb name, I know, but it fit him. He was this scruffy mutt, part lab, part who knows what, but loyal as hell and loved the water. We'd spend whole days out there. It was peaceful, you know. Quiet, just the sounds of nature, the water lapping, birds chirping, that kind of thing. A good escape. This particular day, the sky had this weird look to it. Heavy, dark clouds were rolling in from the west. You could tell a storm was brewing. But it was still pretty calm by the lake, a strange, eerie calm, like everything was holding its breath. The air was thick and humid, the kind that just hangs on you and makes you sweat even when you're doing nothing. I'd been out on the lake in my little boat for a few hours already. Not catching much, just a couple of small bass. Nothing to write home about. But I wasn't really there for the fish. It was more about being out there alone with Bird Dog, just chilling, you know? Bird Dog was on the boat with me, as always. He was sitting up front, ears perked, sniffing the air. He was always more aware of things than me. Suddenly, he went still, completely rigid. His ears shot forward, and he started this low, almost silent growl in his throat. I looked up, wondering what had caught his attention. He was staring at the shoreline, to my left, towards this really dense patch of woods that came right down to the water's edge. At first I didn't see anything, just trees and bushes and shadows. Then I spotted it, a figure, standing right at the edge of the water, near these big, gnarly old trees. It was far enough away that it was hard to make out details, but it looked humanoid, tall and skinny, kind of hunched over. It was still, just standing there, facing the water. My first thought was, maybe it's another fisherman. But it was a weird spot for fishing. Too overgrown, too hard to get to from the road, and it just looked off. The way it was standing, so still, and the way Bird Dog was acting, all tense and growly. Curiosity got the better of me, stupidly maybe, but I was curious. I figured I'd just drift a little closer, see if I could get a better look. Maybe say hello. I started paddling the boat slowly, keeping an eye on the figure. It hadn't moved an inch. The closer I got, the more uneasy I felt. There was something about the stillness of it that was just wrong. And Bird Dog's growl was getting a little louder now, more insistent. He was practically vibrating with tension. I was maybe 50 yards away from the shoreline when it happened. Just as I was starting to make out more details, it was definitely tall, and it was pale, or looked pale from this distance. It moved. Not just moved, it bolted. And it moved uphill, away from the water into the woods. The speed of it, that's what really threw me. It was like it was on springs. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone, disappearing up the slope, weaving between the trees like it was nothing. No normal person moves like that. No way! As it vanished into the trees, something else happened. A sound. It started as a low growl, deep and guttural, that seemed to rumble up from the earth itself. Then it turned into a scream. Not a human scream. This was animal, but not like any animal I'd ever heard. It was high-pitched, piercing, and full of something, rage, pain. I don't know. It went right through me, made my skin crawl, made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Bird Dog went ballistic. He was barking like crazy now, a frantic, scared bark, trying to jump out of the boat, eyes wide and wild. And then I saw it. From behind this massive, ancient oak tree, it stepped out. It was huge, way bigger than I could have imagined from just seeing that figure at the water's edge. It towered over the tree, easily 8 or 9 feet tall, maybe more. It was hairy, covered head to toe in dark, shaggy fur. It was lean but powerfully built, like all muscle and sinew. And its arms, they were long, really long, hanging down past its knees. It wasn't walking upright exactly, more like I don't know, a loping stance. But it was tall, monstrously tall. The scream came again, louder this time, closer. It was definitely coming from this thing. It threw back its head and just roared. It was deafening. The sound echoed across the lake, bouncing off the trees. It was a sound that felt primal, like something ancient and angry. My heart was hammering in my chest. I felt this wave of cold fear wash over me, colder than ice water. I was paralyzed for a split second, just staring at this thing, trying to process what I was seeing. It was real. This was no bear, no deer, no person in a suit. This was something else, something wrong. Then I saw its face. It turned its head slightly towards me, and I caught a glimpse of its face. And that's what really messed me up. Because its body was this monstrous, hairy thing, but its face was almost human, or human-like. It was pale, like the figure I'd seen by the water, but hairless, completely smooth and pale. No fur on its face at all. It was narrow, almost gaunt, with high cheekbones, and these dark eyes, deep-set, dark eyes that seemed to stare right through me. They weren't animal eyes. There was something in them, something intelligent, something mean. And the contrast between that almost human face and that monstrous body, it was sickening. And then I noticed something else on the ground near it, scattered all around the base of the tree, near its feet, dead fish, lots of them. Bass mostly, but some catfish too. All dead, lying on the ground, some half-eaten. It looked like it had been feeding, and it had been disturbed by me, disturbed by Bird Dog. The realization hit me like a punch in the gut. This thing was pissed. It was angry that I was there, that I'd interrupted its meal. I don't know what it was doing, eating fish on the shoreline like that. It made no sense, but it was territorial, and I was too close. That's when the instinct to run kicked in. Panic. Pure, unadulterated panic. I didn't think, I just reacted. I yanked the starter cord on the boat motor hard, praying it would start. It sputtered, coughed, and then roared to life. I jammed the throttle forward as hard as I could. The boat lurched forward, throwing Bird Dog and me back in our seats. I didn't even think about steering. I just pointed the boat straight out into the lake, away from the shoreline, away from that thing. I didn't look back right away. I just focused on getting away, on putting as much distance between me and that creature as possible. The boat was bouncing across the water, spray flying everywhere. Bird Dog was still barking, but now it was more like whimpering, huddled down on the floor of the boat, trembling. I could feel myself shaking too. My hands were clammy on the steering wheel. My legs felt like jelly. It took me a while to finally dare to look back. I cut the throttle a little, slowing down, and turned around. The shoreline was still there, the trees, the lake, but the creature was gone, just vanished, like it had never been there at all. Only the memory of it burned into my mind, and the lingering fear that was still gripping me tight. I didn't stop until I was across the entire lake, miles away from that spot. I beached the boat on the other side, my legs shaky as I stepped onto the shore. Bird Dog was still freaked out, clinging to my side. I sat down on a log, trying to catch my breath, trying to calm down. The storm clouds were getting closer now. The sky was almost black. The air was thick with the smell of ozone. You could feel the electricity in the air. I knew I should just go home, forget about it, pretend it never happened. But something kept nagging at me. A kind of morbid curiosity, maybe. Or maybe I just couldn't believe what I'd seen. Maybe I needed to see it again, or see something that would prove to myself it wasn't just some crazy hallucination. Stupid idea, I know, in hindsight. But I couldn't shake it. After a while, when my heart rate had slowed down a bit and Bird Dog seemed a little calmer, I started the boat again. Slowly, cautiously, I steered it back across the lake, back towards that side of the shoreline. It was even darker now. The approaching storm was really making it feel like twilight, even though it was still afternoon. The trees looked darker, the shadows deeper. Everything felt heavier, more oppressive. As I got closer to the spot where I'd seen the creature, my stomach started to clench again. Bird Dog started to whine softly. I kept the boat further out this time, didn't go as close to the shoreline. I scanned the trees, my eyes darting back and forth, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing, just trees, shadows, and the eerie silence. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the water against the boat and Bird Dog's quiet whimpering. I circled the area a couple of times, straining my eyes, listening for anything. Nothing. It was like it had completely disappeared off the face of the earth. There wasn't even a broken branch, no sign of struggle, just nothing. Finally, I decided to go ashore. Again, stupid, I know, but I needed to see. I beached the boat a little further down the shore from where I'd seen it, and got out. Bird Dog was reluctant to leave the boat, but I coaxed him out with me. He stuck close to my heels, tail tucked between his legs, ears flat against his head. I walked along the shoreline towards the spot where I'd seen the creature emerge from behind the tree. As I got closer, the air felt colder. a chill that wasn't just from the approaching storm. I could feel it in my bones. And there was a smell, too. Faint, but musky, animalistic. It made my nose wrinkle. And then I saw the fish, exactly where I'd seen them before, scattered on the ground near the base of that big oak tree. Dead, rotting in the humid air. The smell was stronger here, mixed with the earthy smell of damp soil and decaying leaves. It was disgusting and unsettling. I looked up at the tree, the same ancient oak. It was massive. I walked over to it and stood at the base, looking up at its branches reaching towards the sky. And then I did something even weirder. I know I was asking for trouble, but I had to know. I had to confirm what I thought I'd seen. I paced back a few steps to where I'd been in the boat when the creature emerged. Then I looked at the tree, and I tried to imagine it standing there, behind the tree. I looked at the height of the lowest branches, the thickness of the trunk, everything. And I realized it was even bigger than I'd first thought. To stand behind that tree like it did, and be almost completely hidden, but still towering over it, it had to be enormous. I paced off the height of the tree as best I could. From the ground to the branch, it seemed to be peeking out from behind. Pacing isn't precise, but I got a rough estimate. At least 8 feet to that branch, probably more. And the creature had been taller than that. Way taller. My earlier guess of 8 or 9 feet was probably low. It was easily over 10 feet, maybe even more. A 10-foot-tall, hairy thing. I stood there for a moment, just staring at the tree, the dead fish, the darkening woods. The wind was picking up now, rustling the leaves in the trees. Thunder rumbled in the distance. The storm was almost on us, and I was standing there, alone in the woods, on the shore of a deserted lake, in the gathering darkness, realizing I'd just come face to face with something I couldn't explain. The fear started to creep back in, stronger this time. Not just the immediate panic, but a deeper, colder fear. A fear of the unknown, a fear of what else might be out there, hidden in the woods, lurking in the shadows. A fear that I had stumbled into something I wasn't meant to see. I didn't stay any longer. I turned around, practically dragging Bird Dog with me, and hurried back to the boat. I pushed it off the shore, jumped in, and started the engine again. I got out of there as fast as I could, leaving the dead fish, the monstrous tree, and the lingering smell behind me. I didn't stop until I was back home, locked inside my house, with all the doors and windows bolted shut. I've never gone back to that lake, not since that day. I sold the boat, eventually moved away from that area. I just couldn't shake it. The image of that thing, its size, that scream, that almost human face. It's stuck in my head, like a nightmare you can't wake up from. I've told a few people about it over the years, friends mostly. They look at me like I'm crazy, or they laugh it off, say it was a bear or a moose or something. They don't understand. They weren't there. They didn't see what I saw. So I've mostly kept it to myself, buried it down, tried to forget about it. But sometimes, especially at night when it's quiet and dark, it comes back. That scream echoing across the lake. Those dark, intelligent eyes staring at me from behind the trees. And the question that keeps gnawing at me, the one I can't answer, the one that chills me to the bone every time I think about it. How does something that big, that monstrous, stay hidden? How is it possible for something like that to exist, right here, in our world, without anyone else seeing it? Without anyone knowing? I don't know. I really don't. And maybe I don't want to know. But sometimes I can't help but wonder, what if it's still out there, still hidden in the woods, by the lake, watching, waiting? Story 6. It's been years, decades even, but I still wake up sometimes in a cold sweat. Martha says I talk in my sleep then, mumbling about growls and shadows. She nudges me gently, tells me it was just a dream, but it never feels like just a dream. It feels real, like it's still out there somewhere. We moved to that old farmhouse just outside Havenwood, Ohio, back in the summer of '74. God, that summer heat was something else, thick and heavy, hanging in the air day and night. The house was a fixer-upper, that's for sure. But Martha, bless her heart, she saw the potential. Me and Carl, her brother, we just saw work. But she had this way of picturing things, making them seem better than they were. And it was cheap, dirt cheap, which is why we could afford it. The lane leading to the house was long, like really long, and shaded even in the middle of the day by these old overgrown trees, spooky even then, if I'm honest. Past the ruins of that old abattoir, all boarded up and falling apart, smelled faintly of rot, even after all those years. Then there was the creek, always rushing, whispering to itself. Felt isolated out there, tucked away from everything, which was part of the appeal, I guess. Our closest neighbors were the Millers, about half a mile down the road, but you couldn't see their place from ours, not through the trees and the bend in the road. It was just us, Martha, Carl, me, and our 2 German shepherds, Kaiser and Lady. Good dogs, loyal and protective, thought they'd keep us safe out there. The first few weeks were okay. Hot, sticky work, getting the place livable, but okay. Evenings were nice, though. Fireflies blinking in the yard, crickets chirping, that quiet country kind of quiet. We'd sit in the living room, windows open, catching whatever breeze we could, listening to the radio, just relaxing after a long day's work. Then it started, that growl. It was a Tuesday, I remember, because the radio was playing the Tuesday night baseball game. Martha was knitting, Carl was reading some old paperback western, and I was just enjoying the quiet. Then I heard it. Low, almost like a rumble in the distance. I thought maybe it was thunder, heat lightning. You know how it gets in the summer. But the sky was clear, full of stars already. It grew a little louder and I realized it wasn't thunder. It was a growl, low frequency, deep, vibrating in the air. My stomach kind of clenched up, that feeling when you know something's not right, but you can't quite place it. "Hear that?" I asked, not wanting to sound like an idiot. Martha paused her knitting, tilted her head. "Hear what, honey?" Carl looked up from his book. "Yeah, kind of like a dog growling." "But deeper," I said. "Way deeper. And it's constant." We all listened. The growl was definitely there, a low, continuous rumble that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. At first we thought maybe it was one of the dogs. Maybe Kaiser got himself in a fight with a raccoon or something out back. But then I remembered. Kaiser and Lady were inside, had been since we finished dinner. They were laying on the rug by the front door, quiet as church mice. Except they weren't completely quiet. Now that I was really listening, I could hear them too, low whimpers, almost like they were scared. And then the growl got louder, significantly louder. No longer a rumble, but a definite, menacing growl, like something huge and angry was right outside the house. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "Dogs are getting restless," Carl said, his voice a little tight. He put his book down. Martha stopped knitting altogether. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the window behind me. "What is that?" she whispered. I tried to stay calm, tried to rationalize it. Maybe it's just some kind of animal. Bobcat? Bear? Though bears aren't really common around here, are they? My voice sounded weaker than I wanted it to. Then came the thud. Not just a thud. It was a bang, a deafening, bone-jarring thud that felt like the house itself had been hit by a truck. It came from the back wall of the house, the wall by the kitchen. The whole house shuddered. Dishes rattled in the cabinets. The floor vibrated under our feet. My heart leaped into my throat. Adrenaline flooded my veins. I shot up from my chair, knocking it over backwards with a crash. Martha gasped. Carl swore. The dogs went ballistic, barking, snarling, lunging at the front door, fur bristling. "What in God's name was that?" Martha cried, clutching her chest. I didn't answer. I was already moving. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what could have made a sound like that. Tree falling. But the house didn't sound like it had been hit by a tree. It sounded impacted, like something big and solid had slammed into it. I ran to the kitchen door, fumbling for the latch, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work it. "Martha, Carl, bolt the front door," I yelled over my shoulder, "just in case, and stay inside." I swung the kitchen door open and stepped out onto the back porch. Darkness, oppressive, thick darkness, like you could reach out and touch it. The only light was the dim bulb above the porch, casting a weak, yellowish glow that barely pushed back the blackness. And there they were, Kaiser and Lady, agitated, tails tucked between their legs, whimpering and growling low in their throats. Kaiser was closest to me, pacing nervously, glancing back into the darkness beyond the porch light. Lady was further back, practically cowering against the wall of the house. They weren't barking aggressively, not like they would if it was just a raccoon or a possum. This was different. This was fear, pure, raw fear. I'd never seen them like this before. Fear twisted in my own gut. Something had spooked them, something bad, and whatever it was, it had just slammed into our house. I scanned the darkness, my eyes straining, trying to penetrate the inky blackness beyond the feeble porch light. Couldn't see a thing, just trees, shadows, and the faint rustling of leaves in the night breeze. But the growl, it was still there. Closer now, it seemed, like it was circling the house. My hand went instinctively to my belt. Damn it, I hadn't brought my gun in from the truck. Stupid, stupid, stupid. All I had was... I remembered the hunting knife I'd been sharpening earlier that day. It was still on the kitchen counter. I turned back to the kitchen, grabbed the knife. It felt small in my hand, flimsy against whatever was out there. But it was better than nothing. Knife in hand, heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird, I stepped off the porch and into the yard. The gravel crunched under my boots. The dogs whined, pressed closer to the house. "Kaiser! Lady!" I called softly, trying to sound braver than I felt. "What is it? What's out there?" No answer from them except more whimpers and nervous shuffling, and the growl. It was coming from the trees beyond the edge of the yard now, closer still. I took a step forward, then another, slowly, cautiously, knife held out in front of me. The darkness seemed to press in, suffocating. The air felt heavy, charged with something malevolent. Then I heard it, not just the growl, but rustling, heavy rustling, like branches breaking, leaves crunching underfoot, and footsteps, hurried, heavy footsteps moving away from the house deeper into the woods. Whatever it was retreating. Relief washed over me, so powerful it almost made my knees buckle. Whatever had hit the house, whatever was growling, it was gone. For now, at least. "Kaiser! Lady! Come here!" My voice sounded shaky, but firm enough. The dogs hesitated for a moment, then crept towards me, still skittish, but responding to my command. I patted them, checked them over, making sure they weren't hurt. Just shaken, badly shaken. "All right, come on," I said, leading them back towards the porch. "Let's get you inside." We went back into the house. Martha and Carl were still standing by the front door, faces white, eyes wide with fear. "What was it?" Martha demanded, her voice trembling. "What did you see?" "Didn't see anything," I said, trying to downplay it, though my own heart was still hammering. "Just heard something moving in the woods. Maybe a deer? Big one?" It sounded lame even to my own ears. Carl frowned. "Deer don't growl like that, Edgar, and they sure as hell don't hit houses." He was right. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't any animal I'd ever heard before. That growl, it was something else. Something wrong. We spent the rest of the night on edge, listening, jumpy at every creak and rustle of the house settling. The growling didn't come back that night, not in the same way. But the dogs remained restless, whining and pacing, and every now and then I'd hear a low, distant rumble that sounded suspiciously like that growl far off in the woods. The next few nights were worse. The growling became a nightly occurrence, sometimes starting just after sunset, sometimes later. It would circle the house, always just out of sight in the darkness. And the thuds, they became more frequent. Not always as violent as the first one, but still jarring, unsettling smacks against the walls, the roof, even the windows. The dogs were losing it. They barked constantly, day and night, stressed out of their minds. We were too. Sleep became a luxury we couldn't afford. We'd take turns staying up, listening, watching, jumpy as rabbits. One night, it was my turn to keep watch. Martha and Carl were asleep, or trying to be, in their rooms. The dogs were whimpering by the front door. The growling started around midnight, low and distant at first, then getting closer, circling, always out there in the shadows. Then came the scratching. Not just rustling leaves or branches brushing against the house, but definite, deliberate scratching, long, scraping sounds like claws dragging across the wood siding right outside my bedroom window. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed. Knife clutched in my hand, I crept to the window, peered through a gap in the curtains. Darkness, still couldn't see anything. But the scratching continued, closer now, right under the windowsill. Then it started moving up the wall, slow, deliberate scrapes, like something was climbing, claws digging into the wood. My breath hitched. Something was climbing the wall right outside my window. And it was big. Whatever it was making those scratching sounds, it had to be big. The scratching stopped right above the window. Silence, then a slow, heavy creak, like the wood was groaning under weight. Something was right there, above my window, pressed against the wall. And then I saw it. Just for a split second, a shadow, flickering in the darkness above the window, momentarily blocking out the faint starlight. A dark, hulking shape, huge and indistinct, but undeniably there. And then Carl screamed, not a shout of surprise, a scream of pure, unadulterated terror. It ripped through the house, silencing even the dogs barking. I ripped the door open and ran out of the bedroom, heart hammering, knife still clutched in my hand. "Carl, what is it? What happened?" Martha was already out of her room, looking just as terrified as I felt. We ran to Carl's room down the hall. His door was wide open. He was standing in the middle of the room, rigid, pale as a ghost, staring at the window. "Carl, what is it?" I repeated, grabbing his arm, shaking him. He blinked, turned to me slowly, eyes wide and unfocused. His voice was a hoarse whisper. "The window. It was at the window." "What was at the window? What did you see?" Martha asked, her voice trembling. Carl swallowed hard, pointed a shaking finger at the window. It looked in." He walked slowly towards the window, and we followed cautiously, fear clinging to us like a shroud. He pointed at the glass. "Right there, staring in." We peered out the window. Darkness, trees, nothing. "Carl, I don't see anything," I said gently. "What did you see?" He shuddered, ran a hand over his face. "It was big, tall, taller than the window, just a face. White face, pale, staring right at me." He wrapped his arms around himself, shivering uncontrollably. "Just a face, in the dark." Martha put an arm around him, tried to comfort him, but her own voice was shaking. "A face? Human? Animal?" Carl shook his head, eyes still wide with horror. Not human. Not animal. Something else. Something wrong. I don't know. I just saw it, staring, right into my soul. That was it. That was the breaking point. The growling, the thuds, the scratching, the shadows, we could almost rationalize them away. Tell ourselves it was animals, or the house settling, or our imaginations running wild. But Carl seeing a face at the window, that was different. That was too real, too terrifying. We couldn't stay there anymore. We just couldn't. The next morning, we packed what we could into the truck and left. Just like that. Didn't even clean the house. Didn't say goodbye to the neighbors. Just loaded up and drove away, leaving everything behind. We didn't even look back. We told the real estate agent we had to move suddenly, family emergency, something like that. Sold the house for a song, just wanted to be rid of it. They sold it to some young couple, eager to get out of the city. Felt bad for them, but what could we do? Couldn't exactly tell them the house was haunted by whatever that thing was. They'd think we were crazy. Heard later from someone in town that the young couple moved out after only a month. Said they couldn't take it anymore. Said the house was unsettling. That they heard noises at night. We never went back to Havenwood, moved to a different state, started over. But the memory of that summer, that house, that growl, it's always with me. Sometimes late at night when everything is quiet, I still think I hear it. A low, distant rumble vibrating in the air. And I see that face in my mind, pale and white, staring from the darkness. I don't know what it was. I don't know what we heard, what Carl saw. And I don't want to know. Some things are better left unknown, lurking in the shadows, out there in the darkness. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, in those woods outside Havenwood, growling in the night, waiting. And sometimes, in the quiet, I swear I can still hear it. Story 7. It was a Tuesday, I think. A really nice, crisp day, you know, the kind where the air is fresh but not cold, and you can smell the earth coming back to life after winter. I loaded up my old Jeep, grabbed my basket, and headed out. Parked near this old, broken-down culvert, you know the kind, just concrete crumbling, probably been there since forever. Across the road there was this sad little fishing spot. Looked like nobody had used it in ages, weeds growing up everywhere. Anyway, I jumped out and walked into the woods. Right away it was quiet, the good kind of quiet. Just leaves crunching under my boots and birds chirping way off somewhere. I love being in the woods. It's like a different world. Started looking around for morals. You gotta keep your eyes low, scanning the ground, looking for that telltale honeycomb texture. I wasn't in there too long, maybe 15-20 minutes, just enjoying the peace and quiet when I caught a smell. And it wasn't a nice smell, not earthy, not like damp leaves or anything natural. It was disgusting, like something rotten, really, really bad. It hit me all at once, just smacked me in the face. I stopped dead, wrinkling my nose, trying to figure out what the hell it was. It was strong, overpowering, and it was coming from somewhere ahead. So naturally, being curious and kind of stupid, I guess, I started walking towards it, figured maybe a deer died or something, kept going deeper into the trees, the smell getting worse with every step, turning my stomach. Then I saw it. On the ground, just a few yards in front of me, was this pile. It was huge, I mean absolutely enormous. Excrement, that's the only word for it, but like nothing I'd ever seen in my life. It was steaming a little, still fresh, I guess, and this sickly dark brown, almost black color. And the smell, man, I can't even describe the smell. Imagine the worst garbage you can think of, mixed with something dead and left in the sun for a week. That doesn't even come close. I just stood there staring at it. It was so much, so unnatural. No animal I knew of could leave something like that. My mind started racing. Bear, too big, and the smell wasn't quite right for bear scat. Deer, laughable. This was different, wrong. That's when I noticed something else. Just beyond this giant oak tree, maybe 40 yards away, I saw movement. It was dark, bulky, kind of rounded, just sticking out from behind the tree trunk, like something really big was hiding there. My first thought was, again, a bear, maybe a really big one. But something about the shape didn't seem quite right. It was too thick, and the color was off, really dark, almost black, even in the shade of the woods. I started to feel uneasy, really uneasy. That smell, that pile, and now this thing hiding behind a tree. I knew I should probably just turn around and go back to the Jeep, but my stupid curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to see what it was. Slowly, real slowly, I pulled out my cell phone from my pocket. Not that I had any service out there, of course, but I pretended to make a call. You know, held it up to my ear, like I was talking to someone, just in case whatever was behind that tree was watching. Stupid, I know, but at the time it felt like the only thing I could think of to do. And then I started moving sideways, inching my way to the right, trying to get a better look around the oak tree. My heart started to beat faster, thump, thump, thumping in my chest. Each step felt like it was echoing in the silence of the woods. As I moved, I started to catch glimpses of it, just from the corner of my eye. It was definitely watching me. Every time I shifted a little bit, I could see something dark peek out from behind the tree trunk, then quickly pull back. It was like it was playing hide and seek, but not in a fun way. More like watching its prey. I got maybe 10 yards closer, and I finally got a bit of a better view. It was the rear end of something huge, way, way too big to be a bear, or a deer, or anything normal. It was massive, just this dark, shapeless bulk behind the tree, and the way it moved, those quick peeks, it felt intelligent, predatory. A real cold fear started to crawl up my spine. This wasn't right. This was way beyond anything I was prepared for out there in the woods looking for mushrooms. This wasn't natural. This was something else. Forget the mushrooms. Forget curiosity. All I wanted to do at that moment was get the hell out of there. I stopped pretending to talk on my phone, shoved it back in my pocket and turned around. I started walking back towards the way I came, trying to move as calmly as I could, but inside I was panicking. My pulse was racing, my hands were getting clammy, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up. I didn't dare to run. I was terrified of what might happen if I ran. I just walked, quickly but steadily, trying to act like I wasn't scared, even though every nerve in my body was screaming at me to run. I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead, on the path back to my jeep, but I could feel it. I could feel it behind me. Movement. Off to my right, in the trees, parallel to me. Something was moving with me, keeping pace but staying hidden in the undergrowth. I could hear it, faint rustling of leaves, snapping of twigs, just at the edge of my hearing. Silent, but definitely there. Stalking. That's when I risked a glance. Just a quick look over my shoulder into the trees to my right, and I saw it, just for a split second through a gap in the trees. It was tall. Jesus Christ, it was tall, towering, dark, like shadow, but solid. I couldn't make out details, not really. It was just a glimpse, a fleeting impression of immense size and darkness, easily 7 feet tall, maybe more. It was just there for a moment between the trees, and then it was gone. My breath hitched in my throat. My legs started to tremble. I wanted to run so badly, but I was afraid to turn my back completely on it again. I kept walking, faster now, practically jogging, trying to keep glancing to the side without stopping. I saw it again, just glimpses, flashes of dark shape moving through the trees, always maintaining that same distance, 30, 40 yards, keeping pace, watching. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them clearly. It was a feeling you can't describe, this intense primal awareness of being watched, of being hunted. The woods that had been so peaceful and beautiful just minutes before had become hostile, threatening. Every shadow seemed to hide something. Every rustle of leaves sounded like it was getting closer. Finally, I saw the edge of the woods. Sunlight filtering through the trees, the road, my jeep in sight. I almost tripped, stumbling over a root in my desperation to get out. I could still sense it, behind me, in the trees. Watching, I burst out of the woods and onto the roadside. I didn't stop, didn't slow down. I scrambled for the door of my jeep, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them in the lock. Got the door open, jumped inside, slammed it shut, locked it, all in one frantic motion. And then I looked. I looked back at the edge of the woods, and there it was, standing at the tree line, just inside the shadows, watching me. The dark figure, silhouetted against the trees, still towering, still impossibly large. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there watching as I scrambled to start the Jeep. My hands were still shaking so badly I could barely turn the ignition. The engine finally coughed to life, and I slammed the Jeep into reverse, tires spitting gravel as I backed out onto the road. I didn't stop looking at the woods. And it was still there, that dark figure just watching, motionless. I put the Jeep in drive and just floored it, speeding away from Willow Creek Road as fast as I could. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, expecting to see it chasing me, but it just stayed there at the edge of the woods, a dark sentinel watching me go. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back in town, back in civilization. Parked in front of my house, turned off the engine, and just sat there, shaking. My shirt was soaked with sweat even though it wasn't hot out. My heart was still pounding in my chest like a drum. I went inside, took a shower, changed clothes, but the smell, that awful smell, seemed to stick to me, in my nose, in my clothes, everywhere. And the image of that dark figure standing at the edge of the woods, just watching, it was burned into my mind. I never went back to those woods, not ever, and I haven't been mushroom hunting since. I still think about it all the time. What was it? What did I see? I've tried to rationalize it, tell myself it was a trick of the light, or my imagination playing tricks on me because of the smell. But I know what I saw. I saw something massive, something unnatural, something watching me, and to this day I can't explain it. I have no idea what it was or what it wanted. All I know is I got out of there, and I'm never going back to find out. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I think about it still standing there at the edge of those woods in the darkness, just watching, and I get chills all over again, like it's still there, waiting, and maybe someday it'll be watching for me again. Story 8. I still get chills thinking about it, even now, all these years later. Sterling, Ohio. Man, that place is practically off the map. Grew up there in the hills, deep in Jackson County. Nothing but trees and winding roads. Back then, in the 80s, it was even more isolated. Our playground was the woods, the really thick woods behind Silent Pine Cemetery. Sounds creepy, I know, but when you're a kid, it's just woods. Old cemetery nearby? Didn't really register. Me and my friends, we were teenage boys, you know how we were, always trying to one-up each other, always acting tough. We'd stage these stupid mock fights out there in the woods, near these big old trees. Summer of '86, it was a scorcher, the kind of heat that hangs heavy in the air. We were out there, near this flooded strip mine pond, an ugly scar in the woods, really, filled with dark, still water. It was tucked way back. You had to hike a good bit to get to it, even from the cemetery side. We were planning our usual dumb fight, whispering about who was going to win, acting all macho when it happened. We were quiet, mostly just shuffling around in the leaves and dirt, murmuring to each other. Then, crack. Not just a crack, man, this was earth-shattering. Like lightning hit the ground right next to us, but louder, deeper. We all froze, hearts leaping into our throats. 5 heads snapped towards the sound all at once, like we were controlled by the same string. And we saw it. It was unreal. This massive oak tree, it was a giant, had to be at least 25 feet tall, maybe more, just falling. Not like it was cut or anything. It was just going down, slow motion at first, then faster, crashing into the pond. The water splashed up, dark and murky, and then ripples spread out, disturbing the still surface. Dust and leaves hung in the air, like after an explosion, but in slow motion. And standing where that tree had been, Jesus Christ, standing right there was this thing. It was huge. Absolutely enormous. Taller than any man I'd ever seen, easily 7.5 feet, maybe bigger. Dark, so dark, like shadows had taken human shape, and hairy, covered in thick, dark hair. Bigfoot. The word just slammed into my brain. Bigfoot. That's all I could think. We were just frozen, not screaming, not running, just staring, mouths gaping open like idiots. Disbelief, that's the best word for it. Pure, dumb disbelief. It couldn't be real. It couldn't be. But it was right there. I could see it, smell it almost, this musky, wild animal smell that was different from anything in the woods. It was facing the pond where the tree had just fallen. Then it lowered its hand, this massive hand covered in hair, and we saw. It had pushed the tree over, pushed it like it was nothing, like we'd push over a twig. This thing was strong. God, it was strong. Then it clenched its fists, huge fists like boulders. Its chest expanded, filled with air, and it let out a roar. Not like a bear, not like anything I'd ever heard. Guttural, deep. It vibrated in your chest, rattled your bones. It echoed through the woods, bouncing off the trees, filling the whole world. I swear birds took off screaming from every branch for miles around. Terror should have set in, right? We should have bolted, but we just stood there, stuck. Part of it was fear, sure, but part of it, I think, was this weird teenage bravado mixed with the fact that there were 5 of us. Safety in numbers, dumb as it sounds. We were frozen, but we weren't completely paralyzed by panic. Not yet. We were still in that dumbfounded shock phase, and then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. It just turned. Lumbering. That's the only word for it. It turned and just lumbered away into the trees, crashing through the undergrowth, snapping branches like they were toothpicks. And then, silence. The woods went quiet again, except for our ragged breathing and the drip of water from the fallen tree in the pond. We didn't move for what felt like forever, just standing there, staring at the spot where it had been. Finally, one of my friends, Mikey, I think it was, whispered, Did you guys just see that? And that broke the spell. We all started talking at once, stumbling over words, trying to describe what we'd just witnessed. Nobody made fun, nobody laughed. We'd all seen it, we'd all felt it. The ground shaking from its roar, the heat coming off its body. Even from a distance, it felt like heat radiating off a furnace. We finally got ourselves together and got the hell out of those woods. Ran all the way back to town, didn't stop until we were standing in Mikey's driveway, panting like dogs. We talked about it all afternoon, that night, the next day. Bigfoot. We'd actually seen Bigfoot. 2 weeks later. Stupid, I know, but we were teenagers. We were convinced it was a once-in-a-lifetime thing, a weird, random encounter. We were young, and that kind of stuff doesn't stick. Not really. We got cocky again. We decided to camp in those same woods, near the cemetery, but not too close to the pond, we told ourselves. Dumb. So dumb. We pitched the tent as evening was falling. The woods change at dusk. Everything gets darker, quieter, but in a different way than nighttime quiet. It's like the trees are holding their breath. We were messing around, trying to build a fire, joking nervously, pretending to be brave. And then we realized we'd forgotten the food. Classic teenage idiocy. We'd brought the tent, sleeping bags, dumb stuff like that, but no food, of course. So, me and my friend David, we volunteered to go back and get it. It was still light out, sort of, but the woods were getting shadowy. We figured we could be back before it got totally dark. We headed back towards the gravel road, the one that led out of the woods, back towards Route 93. It was getting darker with every step. The trees seemed to close in on us. The air got colder, damper. That feeling started, the one you get when you're being watched. Prickly skin, hair standing up on your arms, that cold knot in your stomach. We passed this old farmhouse. Run down, paint peeling, dark windows staring out like empty eyes. Creepy even in daylight, 10 times worse in the fading light. Next to the farmhouse was a field, a big open field, just stubble and weeds. There was a security light way off in the distance near the highway, casting this weak, yellowish glow that barely reached the edge of the field. And that's when we saw them. Eyes, glowing white, not reflecting light, glowing white. At the edge of the field, just beyond the reach of that weak security light, 2 white spots in the dark, staring at us. We stopped dead, froze again, but this time it wasn't disbelief. It was ice-cold, gut-wrenching terror. This time, there was no teenage bravado, no safety in numbers, just 2 of us, alone, in the dark woods, and those eyes. And then, turning our heads slowly, like in a nightmare, we saw it. The same thing. Bigfoot. It was sitting cross-legged at the edge of the field, just squatting there in the dark, those white eyes fixed on us, motionless, just watching. This time, there was no roar, no tree pushing, just watching. And those eyes, they weren't animal eyes. They were intelligent, calculating, intense. It was like it was studying us, judging us. That's when we ran. No thinking, no talking, just pure animal instinct. We turned and bolted, blindly, crashing through the undergrowth, tripping over roots, branches whipping our faces. We didn't care about direction, didn't care about anything except getting away from those eyes. We ran and ran and ran until we burst out onto Route 93, gasping for breath, lungs burning. The headlights of cars blinded us as they flew past. We stumbled onto the shoulder of the road, hearts hammering in our chests. We walked back to the campsite along the highway, the long way around, not going back into the woods until we were absolutely sure we were closer to the road than to it. We were shaking when we got back to the tent, tripping over our own feet, stuttering as we tried to tell the others what we'd seen. They could see it in our faces, the real terror. They knew we weren't making it up this time. We packed up the tent in silence. Nobody argued. Nobody made fun. We just got out of those woods and didn't stop until we were miles away. I didn't go back to those woods for years, and when I did, it wasn't at night. Then, the next weekend, foolishness again. But this was different. This wasn't teenage bravado or stupidity. It was curiosity, maybe a morbid curiosity, or maybe we just couldn't let it go. We had to go back, just one more time, to see if it was real, really real. This time it was just me and another friend, Mark. We went during the day first, just to look around. It was weird. Everything looked normal. The pond was still there, the fallen trees still half submerged, but it felt different, heavier, like the woods were holding on to something, some secret we couldn't see, but could definitely feel. We went back at night. Full moon that night, bright and pale. We walked into the woods, not all the way to the pond this time. Just inside the tree line, near the cemetery side. Moonlight filtered down through the leaves, making long, dancing shadows. It was quiet, too quiet. No crickets, no frogs, nothing. Just the rustle of leaves in the breeze and our own footsteps. We were walking slowly, cautiously, listening for anything, and then we heard it. A grunt, guttural, but softer this time. Not a roar, not aggressive, just a deep, heavy grunt. It came from behind us. We turned, slowly, and there it was, standing in the shadows, but silhouetted against the pale moonlight, huge, muscular, but somehow different this time. It didn't roar, it didn't move, it just stood there watching us. But this time there was no fear, not really. There was something else, a strange calm, a resignation. We just looked at it, and it looked at us. For a long moment, just standing there under the moonlight, it felt peaceful. Weird, I know, but peaceful. Like it wasn't threatening us anymore, like it was saying goodbye. And then it just turned, slowly, silently, and walked away, melted back into the shadows of the trees, gone, just like that. We stood there for a long time, listening, but there was nothing. Just the wind in the trees, the moonlight on the leaves, and the silence of the woods. We walked out of those woods that night, and we never saw it again. Never saw it again. I still think about it, though, all the time. What was it? What did we see? What did it want? Why did it push that tree over? Why did it just watch us in the field? Why that last silent goodbye in the moonlight? I have no answers, and honestly, I don't think I ever will. It just happened. Those 3 encounters, in those woods, near that cemetery, in the middle of nowhere, Ohio. And then, nothing. Just gone, like a ghost in the woods. And I'm left with these memories, these chills, and this feeling that something out there is bigger than us, something we don't understand, and maybe shouldn't. And sometimes late at night when it's quiet and the wind is blowing, I swear I can still hear that roar echoing in my chest. Story 9. It was July Missouri heat you could taste, thick and heavy, 1984. Felt like the air itself was sweating. We were visiting my grandma's friends, the Reynolds, way out in the boonies. Deep, deep backwoods Missouri. They had this old farm, the kind with a porch swing and dogs that barked at anything that moved. It was different, that's for sure, than our life back in St. Louis. For a 9-year-old, different was an adventure. The woods around their place, man, they were something else. Dense, green, but that dark, almost black kind of green, like secrets were hiding in every shadow. My mom, dad, grandma, and Mrs. Reynolds, they all decided to go for a walk after lunch to stretch our legs, as my dad put it. I was practically bouncing off the walls with energy, so hiking was my kind of stretching. They were all taking their sweet time, chatting, looking at birds, slow motion. Me? I was a rocket. The path was clear, worn down, like people used it all the time. I took off, full speed, feeling like an explorer leading a pack, even though they were way, way behind. I remember the sound of the woods mostly, the buzzing of insects, cicadas screaming in that summer heat, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was loud, alive. Sunlight peeked through the leaves in patches, making the path dance with light and shadow. I kept glancing back, expecting to see them, but nope, just the empty path winding behind me. I was really hauling. Must have been a good quarter-mile ahead. Easy. More, maybe. I just kept going, thinking I'd stop and wait in a bit, let them catch up, show them I was the boss of hiking. The path curved to the left, and that's when it happened. I wasn't even looking where I was going, really. I was just running, enjoying it, feeling free. Then, bam! I ran smack into something solid, like hit a brick wall solid. No give at all. It stopped me dead. My momentum carried me forward a little, and I stumbled, almost fell. But I didn't fall because whatever I ran into, it was there. Just right there. I blinked. My chest bumped against it. It was hard. Rough, maybe. I don't know. My head was down, looking at the ground in front of me. I looked up, expecting a tree, a big rock maybe that had fallen on the path. But it wasn't a tree. It wasn't a rock. It was legs, giant legs, massive, like tree trunks. Seriously, bigger than any tree trunk I'd ever seen, even the really old oaks in the park back home. They were right in front of me, inches. I mean, practically touching my nose if I'd leaned forward. My eyes traced upwards, but they just kept going, up and up. I was staring at these legs, these things. They were thick, greyish-brown maybe. Rough-looking bark almost, but not exactly bark. Not smooth like bark, more textured, like elephant skin, but way rougher, craggier. And they were enormous, just enormous. My gaze stopped at what I guess were knees, if you could even call them knees. They were these huge round joints, covered in the same rough greyish-brown stuff, and that was it. That's all I could see. The legs just kept going up, disappearing into the leaves and shadows above. I couldn't see anything higher than that. I was too close, I guess. It was just leg, massive, monstrous legs. My brain just froze, stopped. Everything stopped. The buzzing of the insects, the rustling leaves, gone. Complete silence, except for my own heart pounding in my ears. It felt like my blood turned to ice. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I was just staring at these legs, these giant, silent legs. I remember thinking in this weird, distant way, this isn't real. This can't be real. Like my mind was trying to process something it just couldn't. Like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, but a square peg the size of a house into a hole the size of a coin. Time. I don't know how long I stood there. Seconds, minutes, felt like forever, just frozen, staring up at those legs. I didn't even try to look higher. I was terrified to look higher, terrified of what I might see or wouldn't see. It was heavy. The air felt heavy and thick, like I was underwater, and the silence. That was the worst part, maybe. The absolute, complete silence. Like everything else in the woods had just stopped existing, except for me and it, and the smell, or the lack of smell. That's what's weird. Usually woods smell like something, you know, like dirt and leaves and pine needles, maybe a little bit of dampness. But there was nothing, no smell at all, just neutral air, blank, like it sucked all the smells out of the air around it. Then suddenly something just snapped. In me, I guess. I don't know what it was, but the fear, it just broke, and it turned into panic, pure, raw panic. I couldn't stand there anymore. I had to move. I had to get away. I didn't even think. I just reacted. I spun around and ran like I've never run before, ran like my life depended on it, because in that moment it felt like it did. I started screaming, just loud, uncontrolled screaming, like an animal caught in a trap. Ah! I don't even remember making the decision to scream. It just came out, and I didn't stop. I just kept running and screaming, back down the path the way I'd come. The path, it seemed different now. Wider, longer, I don't know. Everything felt different. The trees were like watching me. The shadows seemed darker. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump, even though there wasn't any sound except my own screaming and my pounding feet and my ragged breath. And then, through the trees, I saw them, my family. They were coming around the bend in the path towards me, my mom, dad, grandma, Mrs. Reynolds. They looked tiny and slow, like they were moving in slow motion compared to me. They heard me screaming. I saw their faces change from relaxed and chatting to shocked, worried. They started running towards me. "Clara! Clara!" I heard my mum yell. I ran right to them, still screaming, tears streaming down my face, chest heaving, gasping for air. I crashed into my mom, and she grabbed me, held me tight. "Clara, honey, what is it? What happened?" I couldn't stop crying. I couldn't stop shaking. I just kept pointing back down the path, back towards where it was. There. It was. I couldn't even find the words. My dad put his hand on my shoulder. "Clara, calm down. Take a breath. What was it? Did you see a snake? A bear?" No bear, no snake," I choked out, tears still pouring. "It was huge, giant, legs, big legs." I tried to describe them, those massive tree trunk legs, right there in front of me, inches away. They looked at each other. My grandma gave me a worried look. Mrs. Reynolds frowned. My dad, he just sighed. "Honey, are you sure? Maybe you just got scared by a deer? They can be big." "Deer? No, not a deer. Bigger than a house. Its legs were taller than me, way taller. I couldn't even see the top." I was still sobbing, trying to make them understand, trying to explain what I had seen. They led me back to the Reynolds house, me still sniffling and hiccuping. They kept asking me questions, trying to figure out what had scared me so badly. But no matter how I described it, those legs, the silence, the sheer size of it, they just didn't get it. "Honey, you were probably just startled," my mom said, wiping my face with a tissue. "The woods can be spooky when you're alone. Maybe you saw a big tree root and it looked like something else in the shadows. Or maybe a deer jumped out," my dad repeated. They can be pretty loud when they run away. Probably scared you. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't a tree, I insisted, my voice rising again. It was alive. I felt it. It was there. My grandma tried to be gentle. Clara, sometimes when we're scared, our imaginations can run wild. It's okay. You were just a little frightened. It happens. Mrs. Reynolds patted my hand. Oh, kids have such imaginations. Remember when my Timmy thought he saw a monster under his bed? It was just a shadow from his toy truck. They all chuckled a little, like it was a funny story. But it wasn't funny. It wasn't imagination. It was real. I knew it was real. I felt it. I saw it. Those legs. I'd never forget them. Never. They were burned into my memory, as clear as day. Inches from my face. They just didn't believe me. Not really. They thought I was a kid with a wild imagination, scared by shadows and rustling leaves. They patted my head, told me it was okay, gave me some lemonade, and tried to change the subject. Like it was all just a silly Detske fantasy. That stung. Almost as much as the fear itself, maybe. That they didn't believe me. That they thought I was making it up, or exaggerating, or just wrong. We went home a few days later, back to St. Louis, back to normal life. But for me, nothing was really normal anymore. The memory of those legs, it stayed with me. It never faded. It was always there, lurking in the back of my mind, especially when I was alone, in the dark, or in the woods. I tried to forget about it, to push it down, to pretend it never happened. But I couldn't, because I knew it did. I knew what I had seen, or what I had almost seen, that massive, silent thing in the woods. And it wasn't just the fear, it was the mystery. What was it? What was that thing? It wasn't an animal I knew. It wasn't anything I could explain. It was just something else, something unknown, something huge, something silent, something there. To this day, I can still see those legs, so clear, so real. And I still get that shiver down my spine when I think about it. That cold, paralyzing fear, and that silence, that absolute heavy silence. I've spent years since then, reading, researching, trying to find something, anything, to explain what I saw. Books about cryptids, about strange creatures, about unexplained phenomena, anything that might even come close. Because I know, deep down, that what I saw that day in the Missouri woods wasn't just my imagination. It was something else, something real, something out there. And the silence. That's what gets me the most. It was like it didn't want to be noticed, like it was hiding in plain sight, just standing there, massive and silent, and then just gone. Like it was never there at all. But I know it was. I know what I felt. I know what I saw, and sometimes late at night when everything is quiet, I still wonder, what was it, and is it still out there? Story 10. Willow Creek Road isn't even really a road in parts, more like a long driveway that sometimes decides to be paved. Twisty, windy, trees right up to the edge of the asphalt in most spots. You got that Cuyahoga Valley National Recreation Area all around there, huge and thick. So it's just woods and more woods, broken up by these little stretches of houses that are miles apart. The kind of place where you don't see another car for ages, and if you do, you remember it. I was beat, just dead tired. All I was thinking about was getting back to my place, showering and crashing. My eyelids felt like they were made of lead, and my back was killing me from lugging boxes all day. I had the windows down because it was May, getting warmer out, but still cool at night, that real crisp spring air. It usually wakes me up a bit, but not tonight. Tonight, I was running on fumes. I remember I was listening to the radio, some oldies station, and this song I kinda liked came on, something by the Eagles maybe, doesn't really matter. Point is, I was almost zoning out, just driving, letting the road take me home. Kind of on autopilot, you know? That's probably why it took me a second to even register what I was seeing. I was coming up over this little rise in the road, not even a hill really, just a slight bump. The kind that makes your headlights point up for a second and then back down. And that's when I saw it. Or well, I guess it's when my headlights hit it. At first, it was just this dark shape in the road, maybe 200 feet ahead, right where the road started to flatten out after the little rise. My brain immediately went to deer. Deer are everywhere out there. You gotta watch out for them all the time, especially at night. But even as that thought popped into my head, something felt wrong. Way wrong. This wasn't deer-shaped. It wasn't even dog-shaped. It was just a massive, dark thing. And it was moving across the road from the left side to the right, towards the trees. Then I really saw it. The size of it hit me first, like really hit me, because as I got closer and my headlights got brighter on it, I could see the road sign past it. You know, one of those green highway signs telling you what road is coming up? It was maybe 100 feet past this thing, and I could see the sign through its legs. Through its legs. Let that sink in for a second. This thing was tall, insanely tall. Taller than any person, taller than any deer, taller than any animal I'd ever seen, even in pictures. And it was just striding across the road, taking these huge, deliberate steps. 1, 2, 3. Left foot, right foot, left foot again, and it was across. I remember those 3 steps so clearly. They weren't rushed, they weren't frantic, they were just powerful. Like it owned the road, owned the night, owned everything. And the size, I can't stress that enough. Think about a basketball player, right? 7 feet tall, 8 feet. Imagine that, but way, way taller, like cartoonishly tall, like something out of a nightmare. And skinny, not bulky or muscular, but just long. Long legs, long arms, a long body that just kept going up and up and up. It was dark, just a silhouette against the slightly less dark night sky. I couldn't make out details, not really, just the shape. This impossibly tall, thin, dark shape. And it was moving fast, even with those slow, deliberate strides. 3 steps, and it was at the edge of the road. And then, gone. Just gone. Into the trees. Vanished, like it just stepped behind a curtain. My brain just locked up. Everything went quiet in my head, except for this pounding, pounding, pounding in my chest. My hands went cold, clammy on the steering wheel. I don't even know how to describe what I felt. It wasn't just fear, though there was plenty of that. It was disbelief. It was shock. It was wrongness. Like the world had just glitched for a second, and I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to see, something that shouldn't exist. Instinctively, I jammed on the brakes and pulled the car hard over onto the shoulder. Dust and gravel sprayed up, and the car shuddered to a stop. I turned off the engine, but left the headlights on, just pointing into the woods where it had disappeared. Silence. Complete silence. Except for my own ragged breathing and the frantic hammering of my heart. The radio was still playing softly, that old song, but it sounded tinny and distant, like it was coming from another world. I sat there, frozen, just staring into the trees. My headlights cut a path into the darkness, but they didn't reach far. The woods were thick, tangled, impenetrable looking, the kind of woods where things could hide and never be found. 5 minutes. I must have sat there for at least 5 minutes. Maybe longer. It felt like forever. Just sitting there, trying to breathe, trying to get my brain to catch up with what my eyes had just seen, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined it, that it was just exhaustion, or shadows, or something, anything else. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. I knew what I'd seen, and the more I sat there, the more the fear started to creep in. That cold, clammy, sickening fear that crawls up your spine and makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I took a deep breath, put the car in drive, and slowly crept forward. I kept my eyes glued to the spot where it had gone into the woods. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely keep them on the wheel. I inched the car forward until I was exactly where it had crossed the road. I pulled off the road again, this time on the right shoulder, right next to the trees, just a few feet from where it had vanished. I killed the engine again, and this time I turned off the headlights too, pitch black. Suddenly the silence felt even heavier, even more oppressive. The woods seemed to close in around me, breathing, waiting. I rolled down the window and strained my ears, listened for anything. Branches breaking, leaves rustling, anything that would indicate something big moving around in there. Nothing, just the chirping of crickets, the distant hum of insects. Normal night sounds, but they sounded wrong, empty, like everything else had gone silent out of respect or fear. I sniffed the air, tried to smell anything unnatural, something musky or animalistic or just different. Nothing. Just the clean, green smell of the woods, the damp earth, normal smells. But again, they felt wrong, like they were hiding something. I even leaned out the window, trying to see into the trees. Even in the dark, you can sometimes see shapes, movement in the shadows. But there was nothing, just blackness, deep, impenetrable blackness. It was gone, completely gone, like it had dissolved into the air, like it had never been there at all. And that, I think, was almost worse than seeing it in the first place. The sudden, complete nothingness. 1 second it was there, this massive, terrifying presence, and the next, just empty woods. I sat there for another few minutes, maybe 10 this time, just listening, looking, smelling, trying to make sense of what I'd seen, trying to find some sign, some proof that I wasn't crazy, that it wasn't just a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But there was nothing. No tracks in the gravel shoulder, no broken branches on the edge of the woods, no smell, no sound, no sign, just nothing. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. The silence, the darkness, the feeling of being watched, it was all too much. I threw the car into drive, spun the wheel and gunned it. I didn't even look back, I just drove, fast. Too fast, probably, for those winding roads. But I didn't care. I just wanted to get away from that place, from those woods, from the memory of that thing. I didn't calm down until I was back on the highway, the bright lights and other cars around me. Even then, I kept looking in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see it chasing me, those long legs eating up the distance, appearing out of nowhere. I didn't tell anyone about it for a long time. I didn't know who to tell, who would believe me. Yeah, I saw this giant, skinny monster cross the road in the woods at 1 a.m. Sounds crazy, right? I knew people would just think I was making it up or seeing things, or worse, think I was actually crazy. So I kept it to myself, tried to forget about it, tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, a shadow, my imagination playing tricks on me, but I couldn't. It was too real, too vivid, too big. And it kept coming back, in my dreams, whenever I drove at night, whenever I was alone in the dark. That image of it, that massive, dark shape striding across the road, those long legs, the sheer size of it, it's burned into my brain. It's like a scar. I still drive that route sometimes. It's part of my delivery area. But I hate it. I absolutely hate it, especially at night. And every time I drive down Willow Creek Road, especially that stretch past the little rise, I slow down, way down, and I scan the sides of the road. I look into the trees. I'm looking for it, not because I want to see it again. God, no, I never want to see it again, but because I can't not look, because in the back of my mind, there's always this feeling, this fear, that it's still out there, hiding in those woods, waiting, and that one day, maybe, just maybe, it'll step out of the trees again. And I still can't explain it. I've tried. I've looked online, read about cryptids, Bigfoot, all that stuff. Nothing really fits. This wasn't like anything I've ever heard of. It was just something else, something wrong. And the worst part is, sometimes when I'm driving late at night, in the dark, on some lonely road, and the trees are close on both sides. I get this feeling, this cold, prickly feeling on the back of my neck, like something is watching me from the trees, and I can almost hear it. Just a faint sound, carried on the wind, a slow, deliberate step. Story 11. It was November 6th, 2013. I remember the date exactly because, well, how could I forget? It's burned in my brain, like a brand. I was up in my ladder stand, tucked away deep in those woods in Veridia County, Ohio, near Rye. Private land. Had permission from the owner. Good guy, never bothered me. I've been hunting since I was a kid, practically raised in the woods. Dad taught me everything. He always said, "The woods will talk to you, Silas, you just gotta listen." Well, that night the woods spoke all right. Spoke in a voice I pray I never hear again. I'm not some newbie hunter either. I've hunted all over, Canada. Even went to South Africa once on a plains game hunt. Seen a lot, heard a lot. Nothing, absolutely nothing, ever prepared me for what happened that evening. It was getting close to dusk, that in-between time when the light starts to fade, but it's not quite dark yet. The woods get real still then, the kind of still where you can hear your own heartbeat thumping in your ears. I like that stillness usually. It's when things get moving. My stand was in a good spot, tucked into a bunch of mature pines. Thick needles all around me, smelled piney and earthy. Down below, maybe 20 yards in front, I had a feeder out. Corn and apples. Deer love apples, especially this time of year. I was watching it scanning the edges of the trees. Patient. That's the name of the game, patience. The doves were there, like always. Those stupid doves, always pecking around the feeder, making their soft cooing noises. They weren't spooked, relaxed as could be. Everything felt normal, peaceful even. You know that feeling when everything just seems right? Yeah, it was like that. Right before it went all wrong. It started with the doves. They went dead quiet, just stopped cooing like someone flipped a switch. That's the first thing I noticed. Animals in the woods, they got instincts you wouldn't believe. When they go quiet like that, it means something's up. Then I heard it. Jesus Christ, just thinking about it now, my stomach clenches up. I wish I could scrub that sound from my memory, erase it completely. It was from my left, through the trees, maybe 50 feet, if that. Close, way too close. It started low, like a growl deep in the chest, you know. Guttural, big cat growl almost. But instantly, even then, I knew it wasn't a cat. This was different, darker, something else. Then it went up. The growl turned into a scream. Not a human scream, nothing like that. It was animal, but twisted, like pain, pure agony mixed with raw fury. Imagine a mountain lion screaming, but then amplify it. Make it 10 times louder, strip away any sort of natural sound, and add this layer of inhumanity to it. That's the closest I can get to describing it, and even that falls short. It was a howl, too, a long, drawn-out howl that vibrated in my bones. But it wasn't just a howl. It was like all those things crammed into one sound, a howl, scream, roar. That's the only way my brain could process it. A howl, scream, roar from hell. It lasted, I don't know, 5, maybe 10 seconds? Felt like an eternity. Time just warped and stretched out when that sound ripped through the woods. Every cell in my body went rigid, frozen, like my blood turned to ice. The doves, man, those doves, they exploded, like a bomb went off in that feeder, just a burst of feathers and wings. They didn't fly up, they bolted, straight away from that sound, towards the open field behind me, the opposite direction. I mean, all of them, every single one, gone, just the sudden frantic beat of wings and then nothing, except the silence after. That was almost worse than the sound itself. That sudden, absolute dead silence that just swallowed up the woods. Like everything just shut down, terrified. Even the wind seemed to stop blowing. My heart was hammering, pounding against my ribs like it wanted to break free. I could feel it in my ears, that loud thumping rhythm of panic. My breath hitched in my throat. I was trying to breathe, but it felt like my lungs just wouldn't work right. Short, shallow breaths. I was gripping my rifle so tight my knuckles were white, safety off, finger on the trigger, staring into those woods, into the gloom under the pines, trying to see something, anything. But there was nothing, just trees, shadows, darkness creeping in. I've hunted bear, I've hunted moose, I've been charged by a pissed-off kudu in South Africa. I've never ever felt fear like that, not even close. This wasn't just fear, it was primal terror. Something deep in my DNA, something ancient, screamed at me to run, to get the hell out of there, to not look back. I'm not ashamed to say I was shaking, full body shivers. I wanted to climb down out of that stand and run back to my truck as fast as my legs could carry me. But I couldn't move, paralyzed, stuck, waiting. For what? I didn't know. Something to come out of those trees, something to make that sound again. I just sat there, frozen, scanning the woods, listening, praying that sound wouldn't come back. Minutes crawled by, felt like hours. The light was fading fast now, dusk turning into full dark. The normal sounds of the evening slowly started to creep back in, crickets chirping faintly in the distance, a rustle in the leaves somewhere far off, probably a squirrel. Just normal woods noises, but they sounded different, tainted, like everything was holding its breath. Finally, I got enough control back to move. Slowly, carefully, I eased my rifle back onto safe. My hands were still trembling. I unbuckled my harness, every movement slow and deliberate. I climbed down the ladder stand, one rung at a time, keeping my eyes glued to the woods where that sound came from. Didn't see anything. Nothing moved. When I got to the ground, I felt exposed, vulnerable, like I was out in the open, waiting to be attacked. I kept my rifle up, barrel pointed in the direction of the pines. Walking backwards, slowly, eyes still glued to the trees, I made my way to the edge of the field. Got to the field, I turned and practically ran to my truck, got in, locked the doors, fired up the engine, didn't even bother to grab my gear. Just put it in drive and got the hell out of there. Tires spitting gravel, engine roaring, leaving that place behind. I didn't stop driving until I was way out of those woods, back on the main road, lights of town ahead. Driving home, my mind was racing. What the hell was that sound? Bear, mountain lion, bobcat. I've heard them all in the woods, different times, different places. That wasn't any of them. It was something else, something ungodly. Got home, still shaking, didn't say anything to my wife at first, just went inside, made myself a stiff drink, sat down in front of the computer, started searching. Animal sounds, Ohio woods. Strange screams, Forest, Ohio. Stuff like that, dumb, I know, but I was grasping at straws, didn't find anything that matched what I heard. Just the usual animal sounds, bird calls, coyote howls. Nothing that even came close to that scream. Then, late that night, I stumbled across it. Some forum talking about cryptids, I guess you'd call them. Strange creatures, things people claim to see in the woods. Bigfoot, Mothman, all that stuff. I've always been skeptical of that stuff. Thought it was just stories, folklore, hillbilly tales to scare tourists. But on this forum, someone had posted a recording, called it Ohio Grassman. Sounded ridiculous. Ohio Grassman? Like, seriously? I almost clicked away. But something made me stop. Something pulled me in. Maybe just morbid curiosity. I clicked on the link, turned up the volume on my computer, and then I heard it. That sound. That goddamn awful sound. It was tinny, scratchy, recorded probably on some cheap handheld device, but it was unmistakable. The same growl, scream, roar that ripped through those woods earlier that evening. Identical. Perfect match. I went cold. All the hairs on my arms stood up. My drink slipped out of my hand and spilled all over the floor. Didn't even notice. I just sat there, staring at the screen, listening to that recording over and over again. Ohio grassman, that's what they called it. Some kind of ape-like creature supposedly living in the woods of Ohio. Stories of sightings, footprints, strange sounds. I'd never heard of it before, never paid any attention to that kind of stuff. But after hearing that recording, and knowing deep in my gut that it was the same sound, everything changed. Skepticism went out the window, replaced by something else, something closer to belief and fear, a deeper, colder kind of fear than I'd ever known. I spent the rest of the night online, digging deeper into this Ohio grassman thing, reading accounts, listening to more recordings, looking at grainy photos and blurry videos that people claimed were evidence. Most of it looked like garbage, honestly. Probably fakes, hoaxes, people wanting attention. But the sound was real. I knew that. I'd heard it myself. I'd felt it in my bones. Whatever made that sound, it was out there, in those woods. Maybe still out there now. I haven't been back to that property since. Not to hunt, not for anything. The landowner calls me every now and then, asks if I'm coming back this season. I make up excuses. Too busy at work. Got other places I want to try. Anything to avoid telling him the truth. Truth is, I'm scared to go back. Terrified. That sound, it's still in my head. Plays back at night sometimes when it's quiet. Wakes me up in a cold sweat. I'm a hunter. I'm supposed to be fearless in the woods. But that night broke something in me. Changed me. Made me afraid. Afraid of something I can't explain. Something that shouldn't exist. But does. I know it does. I heard it. And I'll never forget it as long as I live. They can call it the Ohio grassman. They can call it Bigfoot or Yeti or anything they want. To me, it's just the sound from the woods, and the knowing deep down that something unnameable, something ancient and terrifying is still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting, and that sometimes late at night in the quiet of the woods, it screams. Story 12. It was supposed to be our escape, our little piece of heaven away from the city chaos. Me and Eugene, we were burned out. Delaware County traffic, the constant noise, people everywhere. We needed quiet. We found this cabin, well, more like Eugene found it, in Veridia County, Ohio, off Old Route 27. Perfectly secluded, smack dab in the middle of nowhere, halfway between Lake Serene State Park and some tiny, almost ghost town called Zale. Sounded idyllic, right? Serene Lake, forgotten village, woods all around. Just what we pictured. The cabin itself was rustic, definitely not fancy, but solid. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a decent kitchen, and a living room with a fireplace. Big windows looking out into the woods. We even had a porch swing. We brought our 2 dogs then, a couple of mutts really, but they were our family. We thought they'd love it, all that space to run around, and for a while it was good, peaceful, quiet, exactly what we wanted. Then, things started happening. Subtle things at first. Just little things that made you feel uneasy. You know that feeling, like you're being watched. We'd be out on the porch, having coffee in the morning, and I'd get this prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like something was just outside the tree line, staring at us. I'd look, of course, scan the woods, but nothing, just trees and leaves and sunlight filtering through. Eugene would say I was imagining things, city nerves still on edge, but I swear I felt it. The first real incident. It was late one night, probably a year or 2 after we bought the place. Summer, I think. Windows were open to let the cool night air in. We were already in bed, asleep, I guess, or maybe just drifting off. It's hard to remember exactly, but suddenly I woke up, heart pounding. Not from a dream, I know it wasn't a dream. Something had jolted me awake. I lay there for a second, listening. Everything was quiet except for the crickets chirping outside. Then I heard it, a rush of movement, fast and heavy, just outside the bedroom window, like something big running past. Really big. It was so close to the house, right outside the window, I could practically feel the air displace. It went by in a split second, just this heavy whoosh sound, and the ground seemed to vibrate for a tiny moment. I sat bolt upright in bed, grabbing Eugene's arm. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, even though I was practically yelling in my head. He was still half asleep, groggy. "Hear what?" he mumbled. Something just ran past the window, something big." He sat up too, now more awake. We both listened, holding our breath. Silence again. Just crickets and the quiet rustling of leaves in the night breeze. We got out of bed, went to the window. Pitch black outside. We couldn't see anything. Eugene turned on the porch light, but it didn't reach that far into the woods. Just lit up the immediate area around the cabin. Nothing there. We went outside anyway, Eugene grabbing a flashlight from the kitchen. We walked around the cabin, shining the light into the woods, looking for, I don't even know what. Footprints? Tracks? Something that would explain what we'd heard. But there was nothing. Just leaves and pine needles and the usual forest floor debris. Nothing disturbed, no broken branches, no flattened grass, absolutely no sign of anything big running by. It was like it had vanished into thin air. Eugene tried to rationalize it. Maybe a deer. But deer aren't that heavy, and they don't move like that. This was different. This felt powerful, and too close. Way too close. We couldn't explain it. We went back inside, locked all the doors, even though we usually didn't bother, and went back to bed. But neither of us slept well that night. That feeling of unease, that prickling on my skin, it was back, stronger than ever. We told ourselves it was probably just our imaginations, nerves, the isolation getting to us, tried to brush it off, and for a while things were quiet again. Relatively quiet. The feeling was still there sometimes, that watched feeling, but nothing else happened that we could really point to. Years went by. We started to almost forget about it. Almost. Then, the screaming. This was a few years later, maybe 5 or 6 years after the first incident. Autumn this time, I remember, because the leaves were starting to turn and the air had that crisp fall smell. We were in the living room watching TV after dinner, just some stupid sitcom, I can't even remember what. The dogs were lying on the rug by the fireplace, half asleep. It was a normal, quiet evening. And then, the scream. It started faint in the distance, like someone yelling in the woods far off. We both kind of froze, looked at each other. Eugene muted the TV. We listened. It was definitely a scream. High-pitched, animalistic almost, but also human? It was hard to tell. It was just loud, piercing, but still distant. We thought maybe someone was hurt or lost in the woods. Maybe someone from that tiny town, Zale, wandered too far and got into trouble. Eugene was about to get up, maybe call the sheriff, or at least go outside and yell back to see if we could hear anything else, try to figure out where it was coming from. But then, it happened again. And this time it wasn't distant. This time it was right outside the window. This scream. I can't even describe it properly. It was like nothing I've ever heard before in my life, and I pray I never hear it again. It wasn't just loud, it was deafening, ear-splitting. It felt like it went right through you, vibrated in your bones. It wasn't human, not really, but it wasn't completely animal either. It was something in between, something twisted and unholy. Imagine the most terrifying scream you can possibly imagine. Multiply that by 10. Make it raw, guttural, filled with pain and rage and something else. Something ancient and primal that just chills you to the core. That's the closest I can get to describing it. It was like pure, unadulterated horror-made sound. And it was loud. So loud it hurt your ears. So loud I thought the windows would shatter. And it was right there, right outside the window. Like whatever was making that sound was pressed up against the glass, screaming directly into the house. The dogs, they went ballistic. They were asleep 1 second, and the next they were up, barking, growling, whimpering, all at the same time. They weren't brave barks, not their usual stranger-at-the-door barks. These were terrified, panicked barks. They scrambled off the rug, bumping into furniture, tripping over themselves, desperate to get away from the sound. They ran, tails between their legs, to the back bedroom and hid under the bed, whining and shaking. I'd never seen them that scared before, never. Me and Eugene, we just froze, stuck to the couch like glue, paralyzed. My heart was hammering in my chest. I could feel it pounding in my ears, drowning out even the scream for a split second. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't even think. Just terror. Pure, mind-numbing terror. The scream went on, and on, and on. It felt like it lasted forever, like it would never stop. Eugene later said he looked at his watch. It was going for a solid 30 seconds, maybe more. 30 seconds of that sound is an eternity. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped, just cut off. Silence, but not normal silence, not the peaceful quiet of the woods at night. This was empty silence, dead silence, eerie silence, like all sound had been sucked out of the air. Even the crickets had stopped chirping. No wind in the trees, nothing. Just absolute deafening silence. Eugene, I don't know how he did it. Adrenaline, I guess. Survival instinct. He snapped out of it before I did. He jumped up, adrenaline pumping, and ran to the kitchen, grabbed the biggest knife we had, a chef's knife, sharp as hell. He came back to the living room, knife in hand, and looked at me. His face was white as a sheet, his eyes wide, but he looked determined. Crazy determined. "I'm going outside," he said, his voice shaking a little but firm. "Eugene, no," I finally managed to croak out. "Don't go. It's too dangerous. We don't know what that was." "I have to see," he said, shaking his head. "I can't just sit here. We have to know." And before I could say another word, he was at the door, unlocking it, opening it, and stepping out into the darkness. Just like that. Armed with only a kitchen knife and a whole lot of guts, or maybe just pure terror masking itself as bravery. I don't know. I stood there, frozen again, watching him. He stepped onto the porch, knife held out in front of him. And then, nothing. He just stood there, for a long minute, maybe two, straining his eyes, listening, and there was absolutely nothing. No sound, no movement, no sign of anything. He called out once, his voice a little shaky. "Hello? Is anyone there?" Just his voice echoing in the still night air. And then, silence again. He stepped off the porch, into the yard, shining the porch light around, then the flashlight he grabbed from inside. He circled the cabin, slowly, cautiously, knife held ready. I stayed inside, peering through the window, my heart in my throat. I could barely watch. I was terrified for him, terrified for both of us. He was gone for what felt like ages, but it was probably only 10 or 15 minutes. He came back inside, slowly, shaking his head. "Nothing," he said, his voice flat. "Nothing there. No tracks, no footprints, no broken branches, nothing at all. Just silence." He walked over to the window, looked out into the darkness again, and just stood there for a long time, staring. Like he was trying to see something that wasn't there, or maybe trying to understand something that was beyond understanding. He just kept shaking his head, muttering, I don't get it. What was that?" We stayed up all night that night. We couldn't sleep. We sat in the living room, lights on, doors locked, kitchen knife on the coffee table, listening to every creak and groan of the cabin, every rustle of leaves outside, jumpy as hell. The dogs eventually crept out from under the bed, still skittish, but at least they were back in the room with us. They stayed close, pressed against our legs, whining softly every now and then. The next day we just packed. We didn't even talk about it much. What was there to say? We both knew, without saying it out loud, that we were done. Done with the cabin. done with the woods, done with the peace and quiet we thought we wanted. We called a realtor as soon as we got back to civilization, put the cabin on the market, and sold it as quickly as we could. Took a loss, but we didn't care. We just wanted out. We never went back, not together anyway. But about a year or so after we sold it, something made me want to see it again. Just one last time. Stupid, I know. Maybe closure, or maybe just morbid curiosity. I don't know. Eugene didn't want to go, said he never wanted to set foot near that place again, and I understood. So I went alone. I got a new dog after our old ones passed, a big Rottweiler Shepherd mix, Bruno. Figured having a big dog with me would make me feel safer. Probably didn't, but it helped a little. We stayed for 2 days. The cabin was different. Empty, of course, and a little run down, but it felt heavier, darker. Just being there made my skin crawl. And Bruno was terrified the entire time. He's usually a confident dog, not easily spooked. But at that cabin, he was a nervous wreck. He wouldn't go outside alone, wouldn't leave my side for a second. He'd whine and growl at shadows, at noises I couldn't even hear. He slept inside with me, right next to the bed, and still he was restless, pacing, panting, like something was constantly stressing him out. And the thing is, nothing happened, nothing at all. No screams, no rushing sounds, no unexplained noises, just quiet. But the fear was still there, heavy, oppressive, suffocating. It was in the air, in the woods, in the very walls of the cabin. Bruno felt it, I felt it, you could almost touch it. That sense of dread, of something unseen and malevolent lurking just out of sight. It was still there, stronger than ever. After 2 days, I couldn't take it anymore. We left. And I haven't been back since. And I won't go back. Ever. I don't know what we heard that night. I don't know what was screaming outside our window. I don't know what scared our dogs so badly. And honestly, I don't want to know. Some things are better left unexplained. Some places are just bad. And that cabin, that place was bad. Just bad. And whatever made that scream, I hope to God I never hear it again. Never. Story 13. It's been years, and honestly, talking about it still makes my chest tight. Like, actually physically tight. My wife, Penelope, she still gets this look in her eyes sometimes, distant, when something triggers the memory, and I know exactly what she's seeing. It was August 2008, sweltering. Ohio in August is just thick. You know the air's heavy before you even step outside. We lived out in Belmont County back then, and Salt Fork Lake was our go-to for catfish. Nothing fancy, just relaxing by the water after work, hoping to reel in a few. That night was no different. We left the house late, wanting to fish when it cooled down a bit, though cool is a generous word for an August night in Ohio. It was already dark when we got into the state park. Salt Fork's huge, sprawling place. We always stuck to the bank fishing spots. Easier, you know? We pulled off onto Road 23, that little side road that runs parallel to Route 22. You can see the headlights of the trucks and cars going by on 22 from there, so it's not like you're totally isolated even at night. Felt safe enough. We set up our rods, cast our lines, got comfortable. The usual nighttime lake sounds. Crickets chirping like crazy, frogs croaking down by the water's edge. Just normal, peaceful. We caught a few catfish, nothing big, just little guys, but enough to make it feel like it was worth being out there. It was probably around 10, maybe 11. We were just chatting about work, about the garden, normal stuff when we heard it. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. At first it was far off, like really distant. Sounded like screaming, like a woman screaming, but not just any scream, not like someone yelling in anger or even fear in a normal way. This was raw, animalistic almost. Penelope and I stopped talking instantly. We both looked at each other. That uneasy look, you know, the kind you get when something just feels off. "What was that?" she whispered, even though we were in the middle of nowhere. The crickets and frogs, they'd gone quiet. Everything just felt still, except for this sound, these screams echoing through the trees. I tried to play it cool, you know. "Probably just someone messing around over by the campsites," I said. But even as the words came out, I didn't believe it. It just didn't sound like people having fun. It sounded like pain, like pure terror. And then it happened again. Closer this time. Definitely closer. It was still those same chilling screams, woman-like, but distorted somehow. Like if you took a human scream and stretched it out, made it lower, more guttural. It was hard to describe, but it cut right through the normal night noises. And it was moving. You could hear it in the echoes, getting nearer, faster than it should have been. My heart started to pound. Not just like a little nervous flutter, but like someone was inside my chest banging a drum. Penelope's eyes were wide. She didn't say anything, just stared out into the darkness where the sound was coming from. You couldn't see anything, just blackness beyond the beam of our headlamps, just trees and shadows, swallowing everything whole. The screams came again, louder, much louder. Now they were punctuated by other sounds, crashing, snapping sounds, like branches breaking, heavy branches, and something moving through the underbrush, not lightly, but like something big, really big, was forcing its way through. Panic started to set in, real, cold panic. My hands went clammy. Penelope grabbed my arm, her grip tight. "Arthur," she breathed, "I don't like this. Let's go." Normally, I'm not one to run. I mean, I'm a pretty rational guy. But something about those screams, the way they echoed, the raw desperation in them, it just chilled me to the bone. And the sounds of something big moving closer, destroying everything in its path, that was the thing that really broke through my "let's be reasonable" barrier. I didn't argue with her. I didn't try to be brave. I just reacted. Adrenaline flooded me. We started scrambling. We started yanking our fishing rods out of the holders, reeling in our lines as fast as we could, just tossing them back in the tackle box without even untangling them. Chairs got kicked over, bait scattered. We were moving fast, but everything felt like slow motion, you know? Like in a nightmare when you're trying to run, but your legs are made of lead. The screams were almost on us now. It was hard to judge distance in the dark, but they sounded close, frighteningly close. And the snapping, the crushing, it was like a freight train was coming through the woods, except it wasn't a train. It was something alive, something angry. We practically threw our gear into the trunk of the car. Penelope was already in the passenger seat, door wide open, looking out into the woods, her face pale in the dim light of the interior. I slammed the trunk shut, jumped into the driver's seat, fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. Finally, the engine turned over. Thank God. I slammed the car into reverse, foot on the gas, tires spitting gravel. As we backed up, that's when Penelope screamed. Not just a little startled yelp, but a full-on scream of terror. It ripped through the air, and it wasn't like the screams we'd been hearing. This was pure human fear, reflecting back the horror of whatever was out there. I slammed on the brakes, put it in park for a split second, and whipped my head around to look at her. "What?" I yelled, my voice tight with panic. She was pointing out the window, her finger shaking. "It's right there!" she choked out, her eyes wide and fixed on something in the darkness just beyond the edge of the trees, maybe 20, maybe 30 feet away. It was hard to tell in the dark, but it felt like it was right on top of us. I turned off the headlights for a split second, thinking maybe we could see better in the dark without the glare. Stupid idea. It just plunged us into total blackness for a moment, and the screams, those ungodly screams, seemed to intensify in the sudden silence. Then Penelope screamed again, even louder this time, and I heard it too. Not just the screams anymore, but something else, something right outside the car. Heavy breathing, guttural raspy breaths, like an animal panting but amplified, magnified to an impossible volume. and stomping, heavy earth-shaking stomps like something huge, immensely heavy, was taking giant steps. Boom, boom, boom. Each step seemed to vibrate through the ground, through the car itself. Trees were cracking nearby, not just snapping branches anymore, but full trees cracking and falling. The sounds were coming from right beside the car, on Penelope's side. Whatever was out there was no more than 10 yards away, maybe less. I didn't wait to see it. Didn't even think. Just pure, raw instinct took over. I threw the car back into drive, floored the accelerator, and gunned it. Tires screamed again, throwing up rocks and dust. We lurched forward, bouncing and swaying as we ripped out of our parking spot and back onto Road 23. I gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. My vision tunneled. All I could see was the road ahead, lit by the headlights and the rear-view mirror, hoping to God nothing was back there. But I could still hear it. Even over the roar of the engine, over the wind rushing past the windows, I could hear those screams and the stomping. It wasn't fading. It was keeping pace. I glanced in the rearview mirror. Nothing but darkness, just the red tail lights reflecting back at me. But I knew it was there. I could feel it, this primal sense of being hunted, of something enormous and terrifying pursuing us. The car was shaking, vibrating like it was struggling, even though I was pushing it as hard as it could go on that bumpy road. I glanced at the speedometer, 35, 40 miles per hour, and it was still keeping up. Whatever it was fast, unnaturally fast. Penelope was rigid in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Tears were streaming down her face, but she wasn't making a sound, just those silent, terrified tears. I could feel her fear radiating off her in waves, mixing with my own terror, filling the car, choking the air. We finally hit Road 1, that bigger road that connects to 22. I didn't even slow down, just slammed on the brakes enough to make the turn, tires protesting with a screech, then another hard turn onto Route 22 itself. The smoother road, the wider lanes. It felt like we had a chance now. Maybe. I pushed the pedal down even harder. The speedometer crept up, 50, 60, 70. We were flying now. Cars were flashing their headlights at us as we roared past them. I didn't care. I just needed to get away, to get far, far away. After a few minutes, maybe 5, 10, it all blurred together. I couldn't hear it anymore. The screams, the stomping, they were gone. The only sounds were the engine, the wind, the tires on the asphalt. Silence, blessedly normal silence, filled the car. I finally started to slow down, easing off the gas, letting the speed bleed off. We were on Route 22, miles from Salt Fork now, back in the real world. Cars going by, houses with porch lights on, the normal sounds of civilization slowly filtering back in. I pulled over onto the shoulder, put the car in park, and just sat there for a minute, breathing heavily, my hands still shaking on the steering wheel. Penelope hadn't moved. She was still frozen in place, staring blankly ahead. I reached over and gently touched her arm. She flinched, like she'd been electrocuted. Her head snapped around and she looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time since the screams started. Her eyes were still huge, pupils dilated, filled with a terror I'd never seen in anyone before. She whispered, her voice hoarse, barely audible. Did it stop? I nodded, my own voice just as shaky. Yeah, I said. Yeah, I think it stopped. We're okay. But we weren't okay. Not really. Not then, not now. We drove home in silence that night. Neither of us said a word. We just got home, went inside, locked the doors, double-checked the windows and went to bed, but neither of us slept. We just lay there in the dark, listening to the normal sounds of the house, the creaks and groans of an old building, but every little noise made us jump. Every shadow seemed to move. We never went back to Salt Fork Lake. Not ever. We sold the fishing gear, packed it all away, and just stopped fishing, stopped going to lakes, stopped being out in the woods at night. Something in us, something deep down, was broken that night. To this day, we don't know what it was. What made those screams? What was chasing us through the trees? Was it an animal? Some kind of sick prank? I don't know. And honestly, I don't want to know. The not knowing is almost worse in a way, because my mind keeps filling in the blanks with things that are probably way worse than anything real could ever be. Sometimes, late at night, when everything's quiet, I still hear them. Not really hear them, but remember them. Feel them vibrating in my chest, echoing in my head. And I see Penelope's face, that look in her eyes, and I know she hears them too. And we both just freeze, trapped back in that car, back in the dark woods of Salt Fork Lake, with the screams and the stomping getting closer and closer, and we can't outrun it, not ever. It's still there, in the dark corners of our minds, waiting. Story 14. It was just another Wednesday morning, July the 16th, 2014. You know how it is. Same routine. Alarm clock screaming way too early, fumbling for the snooze button, that first gulp of coffee that's honestly more habit than anything enjoyable. Nicole was picking me up like always. We carpool to work, been doing it for years. Makes the commute less of a drag. Plus, gas is insane, right? We both work at the plant over in, well, doesn't really matter where, does it? Small town stuff. We leave early to beat the worst of the traffic and just kinda chat, listen to the radio, whatever. That morning was nothing special, just normal. Until it wasn't. Nicole pulled up right on time, her usual beat-up Corolla. Reliable, but seen better days, you know? It was still dark out, that in-between time when it's not quite night anymore, but the sun hasn't properly woken up. Kind of eerie, actually. We were heading down Eannan Road, that quiet stretch that goes over the Mad River. It's a pretty road, usually. Trees all thick on both sides, river running alongside. Peaceful. Except that morning, peaceful was the last thing it was. We were chatting about some office gossip, probably someone's bad coffee brewing skills or whatever nonsense we usually talked about at that hour. Headlights were on full beam, cutting through the dark, making everything in the woods kind of jump out in the shadows. The road dips down as you approach the bridge, and the river is on your right as you cross over. That's when it happened. Right as we were maybe halfway across the bridge, bam, just like that. Something moved, big and dark, on the left side of the road, coming out of the trees. I yelled, I think, or maybe just gasped. Everything went silent in my head, except for this jolt, like when you hit black ice and your stomach drops, but 10 times worse. Nicole slammed on the brakes. The tires screeched, the car lurched forward, and then stopped dead. Engine still running, thank God. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I gripped the dashboard so tight my knuckles probably went white. Nicole was just as frozen, hands locked on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. Neither of us said a word for a second, maybe 2. Felt like forever. Then, Nicole whispered, and I mean whispered, Did you see that?" My voice was all shaky when I finally managed to get it out. Yeah, I saw something." Understatement of the century. We were both staring, like we were hypnotized. Right there in the headlights, maybe 10, 15 feet in front of the car, was this thing. It was in the road, standing kind of sideways to us, like it had been crossing from the woods on the left to the woods on the right of the road, right in front of the bridge. It was hairy, completely covered in dark fur, dark brown, almost black in the dim light. Long fur, shaggy, and big. Jesus Christ, it was big. Taller than any person I'd ever seen. Even stooped over the way it was, it had to be 6 feet, maybe more. And thick. Not just tall, but solid, like it weighed a ton. Nicole and I are both average-sized women. This was a mountain of muscle and hair. The headlights were full on it. Blinding, probably, and it did something that raised its arm, one arm, big, thick arm, also covered in fur, and it brought its hand up to its face, like it was shielding its eyes from the headlights. just like a person would do if you shone a bright light in their face. I remember focusing on that arm, the fur on it. It was coarse, not soft and fluffy like a dog or something. Thick strands of hair, easily 4-5 inches long. Dark, matted looking, and the hand, it was huge, big, thick fingers. I didn't see nails exactly, but something. It wasn't a bear paw. Definitely not. It looked hand-like, but not human. Wider, bulkier, hard to explain. And the smell, God, the smell, hit me then, full force, like wet dog, but times 10. Musty, earthy, just rank, like something that had been rolling around in the mud for days. It was awful. It filled the car, even with the windows rolled up. I wanted to gag. We just stared at it, frozen, like rabbits caught in headlights, except we were facing whatever that was. It was just there, blocking the road, for what felt like forever, but probably only a few seconds. Time gets all twisted up when you're that scared, I guess. I remember noticing details, stupid details in a way, like the lower part of its body, from the knees down, looked wet, like it had been in the river, dripping a little maybe. The road was damp there anyway, being so close to the water, but this looked different, like river water. Made me think, had it come out of the river? Just climbed right out of the mad river and onto the road? My brain was screaming, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but it just wouldn't compute. Bear. No. Too tall, too upright, even stooped over, and that hand shielding its eyes. Bears don't do that, do they? Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it moved again. But this time it moved fast. It took one stride, I guess you'd call it. One long ground-eating step, and it was across the road, into the trees on the right side, vanished, just gone, swallowed up by the woods, like it had never been there at all. Except we had both seen it, we both smelled it, and we were both sitting there, shaking like leaves. The silence after it was gone was deafening. The only sound was the engine idling and my own ragged breathing. I could hear the river gurgling softly down below, like nothing had happened, like the world hadn't just tilted on its axis. Finally, Nicole let out this long, shaky breath. "Okay," she said, her voice still a whisper. "Okay. Did we just see what I think we saw?" I managed to nod, barely. My throat was tight, like someone had stuffed it with cotton. I think so." She put the car in drive, slowly, like she was afraid to make any sudden moves. We crept forward, over the bridge. No sign of it, just trees, dark woods on either side, the river flowing underneath. Ordinary, except nothing felt ordinary anymore. We drove the rest of the way to work in silence. Neither of us said another word, just processed, or tried to. My mind kept replaying the image of that creature, that hairy, massive thing standing in the road, shielding its eyes from our headlights. It felt unreal, like a hallucination, but Nicole had seen it too. I knew she had. I saw the look on her face, pure, raw fear and shock. We got to work, parked, walked inside. People were already there, joking around, grabbing coffee, normal morning office stuff, and I just couldn't. I couldn't act normal. I felt like I was walking around in a dream. Everything was fuzzy, distant. Nicole looked just as pale and shaky as I felt. We went to our desks, sat down. Didn't even say good morning to anyone, just stared at our computers, trying to pretend like everything was fine. But it wasn't fine, not even close. Later, during our coffee break, we finally talked about it again, in hushed tones, in the break room, like we were afraid someone would overhear us and think we were crazy. "That was Bigfoot, right?" Nicole said, finally breaking the silence. She looked at me, eyes wide. She was serious, scared, but serious. I swallowed hard, took a sip of my coffee that tasted like cardboard. I don't know what else it could have been, Nicole. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a deer, wasn't anything I've ever seen before. And then I told her about my other time, the one from years ago, back in '85, near Old Mill Road, just a mile or two from where we saw it this morning. I'd been driving home late from a friend's house, early morning hours, still dark, and I'd seen something on the railroad tracks. Same thing, basically. Big, dark, hairy, standing on two legs. It stood up from crouching on the tracks and just disappeared into the woods, just like this morning. I'd told a few people back then, my family, some friends. They mostly laughed or just said I was tired seeing things. But I knew what I'd seen, just like I knew what I'd seen this morning. Nicole listened, eyes glued to my face. She didn't laugh. She didn't say I was crazy. She just nodded slowly. I had something too, she said quietly. Years ago, upstate. Hiking trip, heard noises, saw tracks, never saw anything clear, but always wondered. So you think that's what we saw? I asked her, still whispering, even though we were alone in the break room. She nodded again. I don't know what else it could be, Annette. What else is that big, that hairy, that humanoid, but not human? We talked about it for the rest of the day, off and on, trying to make sense of it, comparing notes, the size, the fur, the smell, the way it moved. Everything fit, everything pointed to Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it. And the really freaky thing was, both times for me, both sightings were so close to each other. Same river, same woods, just different spots, like it lived there or traveled through there, regularly, right in our backyard, right alongside our normal lives. It's been years now since that morning on Eannan Road. Life went back to normal, sort of. We still carpool, still drive that same road, over the same bridge. We haven't seen anything again, not like that. But every time we drive that way, especially in the dark, I can't help but look into the woods, at the river, and I get this chill, this feeling like something is still out there, watching, just beyond the trees, and sometimes late at night when it's quiet, I swear I can still smell it, that musty, wet animal smell, faint, but there, a reminder. That morning wasn't a dream, it really happened. We saw something out there, something big, something else, and to this day, I can't explain it, can't make it make sense. All I know is, I saw it. Nicole saw it. And that's enough to make me never look at the woods the same way again. You just never know what's really out there, in the dark corners of the world, hiding just out of sight, waiting to cross your path on a quiet morning drive, and you just hope it doesn't. That's all you can do. Just hope. Story 15. Okay, so this is gonna sound crazy, I know it does. For years I haven't told anyone, not really. Just bottled it up, tried to forget it ever happened. But sometimes, especially when I can't sleep, it just comes back. So I guess I'm finally gonna just put it out there, get it off my chest, you know? It was June, second week I think, maybe 2010. Yeah, gotta be around then. Me and my buddy Mark, we were into ATVs back then. Still kinda are, but less now. We used to hit up trails all over. This time we decided to go to Allegheny National Forest up in Pennsylvania. Marionville Timberline ATV Trail, if you know it. Heard it was good, and we were always up for something new. The morning was kinda wet, rained the day before or something, I forget. But by afternoon it was clearing up, sun was poking through, starting to feel nice. Perfect day for riding, or so we thought. We unloaded the bikes, geared up and headed out. The trails were a little muddy in spots from the rain, but nothing crazy. Trees were thick, everything was green, that deep, dark green of a forest, you know? Smelled like wet earth and pine, that clean forest smell. It was actually a really nice ride at first. We were just cruising along, not pushing it too hard, just enjoying being out there. Mark was following me. He always liked to ride a bit behind. We'd been riding for maybe a couple hours, somewhere around 3:30, maybe 4 in the afternoon. Sun was still up, but starting to get that afternoon slant to it. We came to a fork in the trail. Not a big deal, just one path splitting off another. Easy to see. I slowed down, pulled up a little ahead to wait for Mark to catch up. Needed to decide which way to go, check the map real quick if necessary, although I thought I had a good sense of direction. I killed the engine on my ATV when I stopped, figured I'd just wait there quietly. Took off my helmet, it was starting to get a little warm, plus I wanted to hear the forest sounds, you know, just for a minute. That's when it happened. Thwack! Sounded like something hit my ATV. Kind of sharp, but solid. I turned around thinking maybe Mark was closer than I thought and kicked up some rocks or something, but he was still a ways back. I looked at my ATV, didn't see anything at first. Then I noticed it. Right near the back tire there was this fresh scrape? No, more like a dent. And dirt, like something had thrown mud or... No, it wasn't mud. It was a rock, a fist-sized rock. Okay, weird. Must have bounced up off the trail from my own tire, right? Possible, I guess. But the way it hit seemed too direct, too solid, before I could really think about it. Thwack, thwack, thwack. 3 more hits, almost one right after another. Bam, bam, bam. All in the same spot on my ATV, near the tire. Now I was starting to get a little unsettled. This wasn't random trail debris. These were deliberate hits, and they were rocks. I could hear them impacting that solid, heavy sound. What the hell was going on? My heart started to pick up a little. Adrenaline, I guess. I scanned around, looking into the woods. Trees were thick, like I said, but not impenetrable. You could see in a ways. Didn't see anything. Just trees, bushes, undergrowth. Birds were still chirping, normal forest sounds. But those rocks, they weren't normal. I stood there for a second trying to figure it out when I saw it. A rock, in the air, moving, not just bouncing up off the ground, but flying through the air, coming right for my ATV. My eyes followed its path, tracked it back through the air, tracing the trajectory, and that's when I saw it. About 100 feet, maybe a little more, into the woods to my right, where the trees got really thick, and there was this wall of dense, brown, dead-looking weeds and undergrowth. Crouched down, almost hidden, there was this darker patch, blacker than the shadows, darker than the bark of the trees, and it moved. Slowly, deliberately, it rose up. Whatever it was big, really big. And it was black, completely black, like solid night in the middle of the day. As it stood up, it came out of the weeds, and I saw it. I mean, really saw it. And my brain just short-circuited for a second. This can't be real. This is not happening. But it was. It was absolutely happening. It was a Bigfoot. I know how it sounds. I was a skeptic my whole life. Laughed at those blurry photos, dismissed the stories as campfire tales, made fun of the guys who went squatching. Thought it was all made up, people seeing shadows, bears, whatever, and just letting their imaginations run wild. But standing there, looking at it, 30 yards away, I knew, instantly, no question, no doubt, this was real. This was a real Bigfoot. It was just there, staring right at me. I could see its hand. Yeah, its hand. Massive, hanging down by its side, but I could see the shape, the fingers, thick, powerful-looking fingers, and its arms, long arms, way longer than a man's, and its chest, its shoulders. Jesus Christ, those shoulders, they were huge, like football linebacker on steroids, huge. Bulging muscles even from that distance, completely black fur or hair, whatever you want to call it, covered everything. Head was sitting right on top of those shoulders, no neck to speak of, just mass. Its face, I could see its face. It was dark, shadowed, mostly hidden in the fur, but I could make out features. Dark eyes, definitely eyes, looking right at me. A nose, kind of flat and broad, and lips. Yeah, lips. Animal lips, but still lips. It had a face. Not like a bear's face, not like an ape's face exactly. Something else, something in between, something human-like but distorted, wrong. It was just staring at me. No growling, no roaring, no chest beating like you see in those movies or whatever, just staring, intense, unblinking, and those dark eyes, they were intelligent. Yeah, that's the word. Intelligent, like something was thinking behind those eyes, assessing me, watching me. Fear? Yeah, I was scared, no doubt, but it was more than just fear. It was disbelief. My brain was screaming, "This can't be real. This is a hallucination. You're imagining things, heat stroke, something." But my eyes were telling me something completely different. My eyes were showing me reality, and reality was a giant, black, hairy creature standing in the woods, staring at me. And the rocks, they weren't random, they were deliberate. It was throwing them, it was throwing rocks at my ATV. Why? Was it aggressive? Was it trying to hurt me, or my ATV? I didn't get the sense it was trying to attack me directly. It hadn't charged, hadn't made any aggressive moves beyond throwing the rocks. It was just standing there, watching. Then another thought hit me. Rocks. Warning. Was it a warning? Like, "Hey, you're not supposed to be here. Go away." Or was it defending something? Its territory, its family? Jesus, were there more of them? Were there other Bigfoots hiding in the woods around me? That thought, that really made my blood run cold. One was terrifying enough. More. I didn't know what to do. Freeze, fight, run. Fight seemed stupid. What was I going to do? Punch a Bigfoot? Run? Where? It was already closer to the trail, closer to my ATV. If it wanted to, it could probably cut me off in seconds. But it wasn't attacking. It was just watching. Maybe it was a warning. Maybe it wanted me to leave. And if that's what it wanted, maybe I should listen. Maybe arguing with a Bigfoot was a bad idea. Slowly, carefully, without breaking eye contact with it, I started to back away. Just a step, then another, like you're told to do with a bear, right? Make yourself look big, back away slowly, don't run. Except, this wasn't a bear. This was something else entirely, something I didn't understand. As I backed away, I kept my eyes locked on it. It didn't move, just stood there, those dark eyes boring into me. I took another step and another. I was moving towards my ATV now, thankfully, just a few more feet. And then, without making a sound, without any warning, it moved. It took 3 steps backwards into the thickest part of the weeds and bushes, 3 long, deliberate steps, and then it was gone. Just disappeared, melted into the woods, like it was never even there. 1 second it was right in front of me, the next, nothing. Just trees and bushes again, empty, gone. I stood there, frozen for another few seconds, just staring at the spot where it had been. Was it really gone? Was it hiding? Watching me still? I didn't know. I didn't want to know. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. Adrenaline slammed into me then. Pure panic. I scrambled for my ATV, fumbled getting my helmet back on, jammed the key in the ignition and started it up. Engine roared to life. Didn't even bother putting it in gear properly, just slammed the throttle and took off. Dirt and gravel flew behind me as I gunned it down the trail. I rode like a bat out of hell, faster than I'd ever ridden before. Every nerve in my body was screaming, every muscle was tense. My heart was pounding like a drum solo. I was just waiting for it to jump out of the trees, to grab me, to pull me off my ATV. Every shadow looked like it. Every rustle of leaves sounded like it moving. I kept glancing back over my shoulder, expecting to see it chasing me, that black mass crashing through the trees behind me. But nothing, just the trail, the trees, the empty woods. Still, the fear was there, raw and primal. I just kept going, pushing the ATV as hard as it could go, trying to put as much distance between me and that thing as possible. After what felt like forever, but was probably only a few minutes, I saw them. Other ATVs, coming up ahead on the trail. A group of riders stopped at a muddy section trying to get through. Normal people. normal ATVs, normal everything. Relief washed over me in a wave so strong it almost made me weak. I wasn't alone anymore. I wasn't out there in the woods by myself. There were other people. Safety in numbers, right? Even if it was just the illusion of safety, it helped. I slowed down as I approached the group, trying to act casual, trying to look normal, like nothing had happened, like I hadn't just stared into the face of something impossible and terrifying. I pulled up near them, pretended to be interested in the muddy patch, watched them try to navigate their bikes through it. Just breathed. Tried to calm down, tried to stop my hands from shaking. Then Mark finally caught up. He pulled up next to me, helmet still on, oblivious. "What took you so long?" he yelled over the engine noise. "Waiting for you back there at the fork. You okay?" I just nodded. Didn't look at him. Couldn't meet his eyes. My voice would have probably cracked if I tried to speak. And what would I even say? "Hey, just saw a Bigfoot back there. No big deal." "Yeah, right. We finished the ride with Mark, acted like nothing was wrong, went through the motions. But inside I was completely different. Something had shifted. Something had broken. I was changed. I never told Mark what I saw that day. Not then, not ever. I just kept it inside, buried it deep down, tried to convince myself it was a hallucination, stress, sunstroke, anything but what it was. A real Bigfoot. But I know what I saw. I know what happened. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark or when I hear a strange sound in the woods, it all comes back. That image, those dark eyes, the black mass in the trees. And I remember, and I know. It was real, and it's still out there, somewhere. And that's the thing that still shakes me to this day. I can't explain it. I just know what I saw, and it saw me too.